everything is suggesting that this is an endemic virus. It's going to stay here forever. And we are going to need to be able to use all different types of approach to tackle it. And the recent data I've seen, and obviously you've got Professor Wei Shen joining you, on heterologous boost. So that's basically mix and match of vaccines, looks very positive. So again, the idea of having that breadth of capability in the UK, not just for the UK, we can manufacture for abroad too, I think is important. And I think some of that's being done, but I don't think we're probably doing enough, would be my view right now.
What more should we be doing?
Well, I think we need to recognise that specifically for vaccines, it's not just about procurement. I think we've done plenty of procurement, and that's now working well. But the reason we did well in terms of getting out of the blocks quickly was because we had capability already in UK medicine manufacturing. And that's because we'd invested in it in the long term. And we need to continue doing that, because it's not just a matter of a quick procurement and then sort of wait around for a bit and then go back and procure again. We need to stay ahead of the curve so that we can produce variant vaccines in 100 days or less, which is the goal, and do so with resources and capabilities and teams that are existing and working on this, rather than bringing together people, in a hurry.
Have we retained and built on that capability, or has it been downgraded or expanded since your time at the task force? So
I'm not part of the VTF, and I've been out of it for a year, so I don't know exactly what's happening, but I would hope. I mean, so there's discussions about what happens with VMIC, which of course you set up, and there are two aspects of VMIC. So the Vaccines Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, and the clue's in the name. Manufacturing, it's been scaled to deliver bulk vaccines, and that I think is obviously helpful and an important role. But the bit I'm concerned about, and again, I'm not in the room, so I don't know to what extent that is being addressed, is that the process development and the scale up, because that's the bit that is complex and difficult and is actually the key to getting bulk manufacturing working well. And so I think as you'll need to ask people who actually are in the tent to know exactly what's happening there. But that is the bit that if I was there now, I would be absolutely focusing all my attentions and energies on the advanced medicine manufacturing and the skills and the process development capability, and not just on procurement.
Thank you. How worried would you have been about Omicron were you still leading the vaccine task force?
Well, we've of course expected to get variants. I mean, that's the nature of vaccines. So that itself is not a surprise. And actually, it's not a surprise that it originated in what looks like an immunocompromised individual in South Africa, because this is a global pandemic. So we have to get vaccines out to everybody who needs them, especially the immunocompromised. So was it a surprise? No. The data that I've seen, which is only public data, does suggest that it is, we've not seen severe cases yet in South Africa. Now, it is a younger population. It has had heavy levels of infection, but nonetheless, we haven't seen those high levels of infection. So it may be that it is a more mild disease, and we need to wait and see whether or not that translates in its severity or lack of severity here. But nevertheless, it is clearly quite widely divergent from the original Wuhan strain. And it is likely that if Omicron becomes the dominant strain, we're going to have to, in my view, it would be prudent to develop variant vaccines so that the what I think will be annual boosts, certainly for the vulnerable, will be against Omicron as opposed to Wuhan, which is now, 38 or so mutations different from where we are now. So I think the government is right to be taking this very seriously, but let's see how severe it is. And actually, again, data I saw last night is suggesting that the South African incident seems to be coming down. So it may be that this is a super high transmissible, but hopefully it won't be as severe as we fear.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Thank you, Dame Bingham, for your time today. If I can push you a little bit on what you might know about transmissibility and the effect that vaccines have on that. I know you were heavily involved with the work that was done on the Delta variant and the impact that vaccines had on transmissibility there. But are you aware of the impact of transmissibility of Omicron on particular vaccines at this stage? No,
and that's something you should ask Wei Shen. I've been out of this for years, so that detailed data you need to get from somebody who is living and breathing this.
Okay, thank you. What assessment would you make of the government's approach to vaccine procurement and manufacturing since you left the task force?
Procurement, I think, has been good. So there were two major things done, I think, since I left. One was the additional doses that were secured from Pfizer. And the second was the deal with CureVac. The first generation of CureVac hasn't worked out. They've partnered with GSK, and I would be optimistic that the next gen will be positive. And obviously the Pfizer procurement, I think, has gone well, and relationships with Pfizer have been great. And I think part of that was because Pfizer basically was embedded with the team right at the beginning. So we had a very, very close working relationship between industry and government, which I think was helpful. So I think procurement has been fine. Manufacturing, as I said, I'm less convinced about that because what matters is we have that breadth of capability that is maintained. So VMIC I've mentioned, and we need to make sure that the innovation and the scale up and the process development, so all the difficult stuff is maintained. I mean, I listened to Sarah Gilbert's Dimbleby lecture, and I know there is funding struggles to maintain the Vax labs, which was the very reason that they were able to manufacture their clinical trial batches and get out of the blocks quickly. So I think we need to look very hard at those that capability that's distributed around the UK. It's not just Oxford, but that capability so that we can act quickly as and when we need to. I mean, I think another group that came out was very positive working with last year was CPI. So that's the Centre of Process Innovation. It's the high value manufacturing catapult up in Darlington. So again, their capability is about process development and taking novel manufacturing approaches and industrializing them. So that again is a group that I think should be central in the manufacturing capability, the preparedness. And then I think we need to look at what is the relationship with the private sector, because we struck deals obviously on the manufacturing side with Oxford Biomedica, Fuji, Film Diosynth, and Valneva, and not all those relationships I think are continuing. Now, again, I'm not in the room, so I don't know the exact background behind each of those, but I do think having a close relationship with the bulk advanced manufacturing industry is important. And again, these have capabilities that go beyond the UK. So this isn't just little Britain trying to solve everything just for ourselves. These have the capability to become big export industries. So from a economic resilience as well as public health resilience, I think they play important parts.
Thank you. And finally, do you think that the government has a well-developed variant plan? And do you think it's being successfully deployed in a timely manner?
So the answer is I don't know in detail. I know when I left, Clive Dix put together a pretty comprehensive variant manufacturing, a variant plan, which was really good, which basically looks ahead and figures out what are the potential variants, testing those variants against the vaccines we've got, because of course we funded Porton to scale up that industrialized assay testing to do exactly this. And then if those vaccines don't work, then go ahead and start making tweaked variants before those variants actually potentially emerge. So I know there was a plan. I don't know to what extent it's being followed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'll go to Jeremy Hunt and then Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to follow on from Rebecca's question, actually. Dame Kate, the theory of why you have a vaccine programme is by having population immunity, you can avoid a cycle of lockdowns. And you were generally thought to have done an excellent job when you set that programme off. Here we are a year later, and we're facing more restrictions And indeed, reading the papers today, many people think there'll be even more restrictions to come beyond what MPs are going to be voting on this evening. So I just wondered, with your bird's eye view, what's gone wrong?
I'm not sure it's a matter of what's gone wrong. It's the viruses ahead of us. So what we've got are vaccines which are pretty effective against the Wuhan strain and less effective with a single dose, with a two-dose protocol against the Omicron strain. So again, the data that I've seen suggests that 3 doses works very well against Omicron. And so it's not a matter of what's gone wrong. It's a matter of how can we make sure that the vaccines we have stay ahead of the curve, and we don't just keep buying lots and lots and lots of vaccine against Wuhan when actually we need to start thinking about what do these new variants look like. And if that means 3 doses, you know, that is what we need to do now. But that again is not adequate going forward. And again, if you look at the Public Accounts Committee, their report, the cost of deployment last year when I was in post was about the same as the cost of buying the vaccines that we bought last year. So we can't be in a position where we have to go through this monumental logistics challenge of actually getting vaccines into arms. So again, the other area that I think we must be pushing forward is how do we improve the format of these vaccines so that they're much easier and more cheap to deploy, and whether that's patches, pills, sprays, whatever they may be, we need to find both the tweaked vaccines that can address the viruses, as well as delivering them in a way that doesn't cause the country to have to pay billions more to be able to get them into people's arms.
Okay, just ask the question in a slightly different way. It obviously wasn't part of the plan that we'd be going back into restrictions at this stage in the cycle of the pandemic. With the benefit of hindsight, and accepting that it is with the benefit of hindsight, what should we have been doing differently 3 months ago or 6 months ago?
Well, I would have, now, whether I would have enacted, and again, it may have been done, I just don't know. I would have enacted the variant plan that Clive put together, which is to go ahead and start predicting what are the potential mutations we could face and what is the diminution of protection that you get from the existing vaccines with those variants. And I'd have started making them. Now, one of the reasons we worked with Valneva was to have that capability to grow up variant vaccines. Now, it's not trivial, and not every virus can be grown, but that is one of the ideas of how would you get ahead of the mutations of the vaccine. So it may be that it's been done. I certainly read in the press that the different vaccine companies are creating Omicron variants. But that's what I think we should be doing, and both historically and we should be doing in the future, is predicting what they're going to be and making vaccines accordingly. But testing, I mean, we've got the capability to test head to head how effective the vaccines are against these. And I think it's, you know, our focus last year was very much about speed. And it wasn't about, you know, getting the perfect vaccine. And what's become clear is the rate of mutation here is quite rapid. So actually speed was the right instruction that we were given. And I think that is correct. But we just have to be nimble in how quickly we can manufacture these variant vaccines, because I think we're going to have to produce the variants.
Thank you very much. Karen Monaghan.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Kate, both yourself and Dr. Clive Dix have been critical of the government's decision to cancel the Valneva contract. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Why was this problematic?
Problematic on various counts. So this is the whole virus-based manufacturing capability up in Livingston, Scotland. So one of the things that we were keen to do was to make sure that the UK has flexible, state-of-the-art manufacturing capability to deal with whatever potential current or future pandemic virus comes along. And so by cancelling the contract, that means we lose that capability. That plant's not fully built yet. And without completing the funding as per the contract, we won't get either the capability or the jobs and the people trained to actually manufacture vaccines. Now, these plants are flexible, so it doesn't mean you only can manufacture whole virus-based vaccines. You can manufacture mRNA, adeno, protein-based vaccines, or even antibodies. So to me, it was short-sighted to cancel a capability which, of a state-of-the-art advanced manufacturing plant, which would have brought skills and jobs and economic benefits to the UK over and above any vaccines that we may or may not procure. So capability is one shortcoming. And the second is, precisely because we've seen this with Omicron, until we vaccinate the world, we're going to continue to get variants. And the vaccines that we could have bought from Valneva, even if we didn't want them, the world could have wanted them, because the Valneva data was strong as when they produced their phase 3 data, and looked more effective than the AstraZeneca vaccine. So to take a decision that just seems to be based on whether or not we in the UK want to use these vaccines for boosters, and clearly the decision was they did not want to use them for boosters, and therefore you cancel the whole contract, I think was short-sighted. So capability, skills, economic, and then distribution of vaccine around the world.
Can you say a little bit about the difference in terms of the vaccine that Valneva were producing? It was a more agile or more adaptable vaccine, is that correct?
So it's a whole virus-based vaccine, which is literally what it says on the tin. So you grow up this pandemic virus in a highly contained environment, you then inactivate it, and then you combine it with an adjuvant. And an adjuvant is a bit like a cup of coffee in the morning, so it just wakes you up a little bit. And so what it does is wakes up the immune system and says, pay attention to this. This is what you now need to create an immune response against. And its adjuvant was a very novel, modern adjuvant developed by a US company called Dynavax, which is more advanced than the adjuvants that are being used in the Chinese vaccines. So the Chinese vaccines are also whole virus-based vaccines, and they're not as potent as for example, an mRNA vaccine, but because they combine the whole virus as opposed to just the spike protein, it should give a broader immune response, obviously, than just an immune response against spike. And so I think, again, in a portfolio of different vaccines, to me, that seemed a pretty interesting capability to have. But it's the adjuvant, I think, gives it the edge over the other whole virus-based vaccines out there.
So it was surprising that this then would have been cancelled. And Clive Dix also reportedly said before leaving the vaccine task force that he'd presented a plan to Number 10 to fast-track vaccines targeting new variants, but he said, I never received any responses at all. Are you surprised by that?
Yeah.
Thank you. But who do you think was making the decisions when Clive Dix presented that plan to Number 10?
I don't know, because there was a interregnum after Clive left, before Richard Sykes took over. So it'll have been the VTF, which will have made the decisions, I imagine.
Thank you. Before you left the vaccine task force, did you make any legacy recommendations to the government, and if so, what were they? Yes, there's a report that's published on the government website that absolutely gave a sort of account of what we did last year. As part of that, but it was not published, did include our recommendations. So yes, we did give recommendations last year in December. And have they been implemented?
They all are now, but and I will need to pull them up to remember. But it was about how do we actually keep going with the things we were doing. So again, it's about continuing to invest in advanced medicines manufacturing, precisely to deal with all the things we're talking about today. How do we deal with variants? How do we deal with waning vaccine efficacy? And how do we deal with improved vaccine format and stay ahead of it, and make sure we understand what is the what's called the correlates of protection. So what is it precisely about the immune response that is protecting people. So it's about understanding the detailed immunology, because in the headlines that gets reported in the press, we're talking about you're basically just neutralizing antibody responses, which as a headline is fine, but it does not tell the whole picture. So antibodies basically are a useful marker of how effective vaccines can be, but it doesn't tell you anything about the cellular response. So antibodies basically will bind viruses before they enter the cell, and cellular responses, or T cells, will target those cells that have been infected. And we really need to understand what that cellular response is and how we can boost the cellular response over and above antibody responses, so as to maximize the effectiveness of vaccines. And without a detailed immunology understanding, you can't do that. So part of our recommendations beyond the manufacturing capability and scale up and flexibility recommendations was about immunology.
A very final short question. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times the manufacturing capability. Are you disappointed with the sort of what we see on the ground now in terms of our ability to manufacture vaccines?
Well, I'm absolutely disappointed about Valneva. I just still can't understand why we wouldn't want to continue with a state-of-the-art brand new manufacturing plant that we've largely built, but not yet completely built. So that I'm disappointed by. I don't yet know where we are ending up with VMIC. So I only see public statements there, but I'm very anxious to be assured that the innovation part of VMIC will be retained. So not necessarily in bricks and mortar, because I think we're starting to get more of that capability around the UK, but we have to have people and capability to take on new vaccines, new formats, new variant approaches, and do all that process development, which is so difficult. So scaling up from a research lab-based scale into manufacturing millions of doses is highly, highly complex, and it can't be done overnight. And we benefited last year because the government success, over the past had invested in the advanced medicine manufacturing. But I want to see that not just continued, and I hope it is continued, despite what Sarah Gilbert was saying in her lecture. But I want to see it continued, but I want to see it reinforced and expanded, because we're good at it. We've got the skills. I went to a bioprocessing manufacturing conference in Cardiff a couple of weeks ago, and I was completely gobsmacked. Here is an industry where you've got competing companies with people that enjoy and want to work with each other. And this was an industry where they got together and worked cooperatively for something like 6 months without contracts. And again, supported by the work led by Sandy Douglas in Oxford, where again, he completely drove how the Oxford vaccine was scaled and got out. Now, that sort of industry is one we should treasure and support, rather than cut them off at the knees by cancelling contracts and alleging breach.
Thank you, Dame Kate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Carol. Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of quick questions. Thank you very much for your time, Dame Kate. Number one, just your recommendations that you spoke of just now. Could we have those sent to the committee, please?
Yeah, I just need to find them, but yes.
Brilliant, thank you. And what was your reaction when you learned that the government threw away 600,000 vaccines? And did you have anything in place that would have stopped that happening?
It's not really my area. I mean, the deployment, we had astonishingly positive relationships with Department of Health and the teams there, but they were responsible for deployment, not us. Our job was basically to get vaccines to them to then deliver.
Were you shocked though that 600,000 were thrown away or disposed of?
Well, I'm afraid it's not just the UK. There are vaccines that are being wasted around the world. And again, I think it reinforces the need that all governments are ahead of the curve. And if we're not going to be able to deliver, get those vaccines into arms, then we should get them into places where they need the vaccines and can get them into arms.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dame Kate, for everything that you've done now and your candour today. I just wanted to return to the production of vaccines against variants and different areas. Do you have any insight in terms of timescales or when we can perhaps look to have a new jab that's a bit more whizzy and all singing and all dancing?
Yeah, I mean, the 100 days is not crazy. So the design, I mean, the quickest to design new vaccines will be mRNA. So to design will be really quite quick. And then to scale and to demonstrate clinical efficacy and safety, I mean, it's a stretch, but it could be done in 100 days. So thinking about March next year isn't beyond the realms of possibility, but we need to have that capability to be able to do it. Rather than just rely on companies always being ahead of the game to do it. So that I think, again, that's the sort of forward thinking. We need to enable that to happen. And of course, we use the brilliant NIHR. So our national clinical trials capability was completely game changing and will continue to be game changing. So I think that side of things we should be able to continue to deliver. So for me, it's the making sure we can do the manufacturing and scale up and the process development, because of course the regulator, MHRA, can't approve it until they know that the manufacturing process is completely consistent and safe and meets all the standards. And that's the slow bit actually, rather than the clinical development now.
Understood. That's brilliant. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you very much indeed, Cam. Just a couple of final questions from me to Dame Kate. In the lecture that you gave a couple of weeks ago in Oxford, you reflected on your time leading the vaccines task force, which everyone acknowledges was a huge success and an example of how to do things. But you said that it's interesting to reflect that the behaviour of the government appears to have changed significantly from my time in the VTF. And you say, it now appears that the waters have closed over the approach that was taken, which was close working with businesses, and that officials have reverted to their usual practice and the pre-existing culture of distrust of business. It's hard to not think of this as a massive opportunity to win as having been lost. Just say why you have formed that concern and what can be done about it.
Well, part of it's informed by Valneva and the idea that here's a small company that is busting a gut to try and support us last year to scale up, build new plants, scale up manufacturing capabilities, develop vaccines for us, and then gets sent a letter from the government alleging breach of delivery, so as not to pay the costs that they've incurred to actually develop the vaccine for us. So for me, that is not a good signal. I have no issue. If the government wants to cancel contracts, they can cancel contracts, but they should pay their debts where they're due. And that we are a small industry, and that sort of behaviour doesn't carry well. And the other example I gave in the Romanis lecture was the plant-based manufacturing. Again, huge opportunity to work with very capable, keen companies that would again establish a very rapid manufacturing capability in the UK. But the decision, again, not by the industry people, but by Whitehall, was no, we have to go through a normal procurement process, which basically is going to take forever and basically means we're not going to operate in that nimble, quick, collaborative way that was so effective last year. So I worry about that, and I worry that the team of experts that we put together to do all the due diligence, whether it's manufacturing, science, regulatory, clinical, I don't think it's been used since I left. So that's the sort of thing which is, again, it's difficult to work in an environment where you don't have people skilled in the areas in which they're working. And you do need people who are scientists, operationally experienced, with links to industry, to actually be able to think about some of these long-term strategic problems and be creative about how you solve them. And I think if we basically don't have the skills and we don't have the industry relationships, and where we do have industry relationships, we don't look after them, I don't think that puts us in a very strong position.
Thank you very much. And a final question to me. In answer to my first question, you described where we are with the virus as entering a period in which it is endemic. Could you just sort of say how you respond to an endemic virus as opposed to the pandemic that we've experienced for most of the period so far?
So it means that the virus is going to circulate, I think, forever. Now, I hope it will circulate in a less virulent form. And it means that we have to basically manage it as we would do with flu, which is also an endemic virus. And so that means we have to identify who's most at risk. We need to continue to protect those people forever. It's, again, you've got Wei Shen coming up, and he will be a lot more thoughtful about than I would. But my expectation is that those most vulnerable should be vaccinated regularly. That may be only yearly now. So that, to me, means all adults over the age of 50 and all adults under 50 with severe underlying disease, and anybody else that JCVI recommends. And they would be given routine vaccinations. And then if, depending on the severity, it may need to go beyond those high-risk groups. But I think initially we're going to have to think about how do we keep those high-risk groups protected forever. Now, some level of viral presence may provide a natural boost, and that itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But we just need to understand what is the actual strain of virus and what's the consequence of it in terms of what the vaccine is going to need to look like and who needs to get them.
Dame Kate, thank you very much indeed for your evidence to us. We're very grateful, as the country is, for your work in leading the Vaccines Task Force. You've been very helpful to the committee throughout our inquiries, and we're very grateful for your evidence today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
I'm now going to welcome our next witness, who I'm very pleased to introduce, from South Africa, Dr. Angelique Kutsia is joining us. Dr. Kutsia is the chair of the South African Medical Association and was one of the first clinicians in that country to have detected what turned out to be the presence of the Omicron variant. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Kutsia. Perhaps you can just summarise for us, given your experience of, I think, about 5 weeks now in South Africa, summarise how much more transmissible Omicron is compared to the Delta variant. Perhaps starting with that, what have you found on that?
Good morning, and thank you for asking our opinion. If we look at the transmissibility of the Omicron virus, it is most probably equal currently to Delta, and it might be more transmissible than Delta. We would only know as the time progresses and we reach the top of our curve regarding whether it would have been more. But for now, it's definitely on par. And as I've said, it can even be more transmissible at the end of the day.
Thank you very much indeed. Then a similar question in terms of the severity of the disease that is associated with Omicron compared to Delta. What's your experience so far in South Africa?
Thank you. I'm going to answer it in two ways. First of all, regarding primary health care, the predominantly picture that we are seeing here are that of a mild disease. But however, we see a different picture in the hospital admissions, especially around unvaccinated people, of which the majority are unvaccinated. Unfortunately, in our hospital in ICU, we do not have the stats to determine whether it is Omicron versus Delta. We do sequencing around about 1 per 200 patients. So will be done a sequencing. So we only look there at the clinical picture. Again, if we look at the current cases in the ICU, our ICUs are still not overwhelmed by COVID cases. Also, if we report our hospital admissions, it's a mix of people incidentally being found positive with COVID-19, admitted for any other disease except for COVID-19. And then you will have people in ICU that is there predominantly of COVID-19. And our death rates, unfortunately, are also reported as just COVID-19 death rates. Although our death rates are quite low, the numbers. So again, the severity, everyone admitted in ICU is always a severe case. Whether it's Omicron versus Delta, we cannot comment on that.
I see. So reflecting on the pattern of severe disease and hospitalisation from COVID, given that you can't necessarily split them between the two, we're now a few weeks since the first detection of Omicron. What has been the experience in terms of hospitalisations from COVID more generally across South Africa during that time?
If I can give you some of the stats from the 9th of December, our death rate, it was on the 9th was 22 patients, on the 10th was 49 patients, on the 11th 36 patients, on the 13th it was 11 patients yesterday. So we don't have that huge amount of, as we have said, death rates. Currently, we are extremely grateful for that. If we, however, also looked at our cases being positive in the general public, on 9th of December, it was 22,390. On the 10th, it was 19,000. 11th, 17,000. 12th, on the 12th, 18,000. On yesterday, 13,992. Our positivity rate, depends on how many people go and get tested during, a specific day. But it is more or less, yesterday was now a high positivity rate because not a lot of people went for tested. It was 31, but the average is around about 25% on our positivity rate. However, yesterday, the hospital admissions across South Africa was 422 again, and again, as I've said earlier, it doesn't, it includes the mix of incidental findings as well as sick people. Then regarding the oxygen needs of patients, we have seen the patients that's been admitted and it's incidentally or been admitted with, because our public sector system will sometimes, if there's a problem at home and the patient present and it's positive, keeping in mind what we have seen with Delta, we will admit them for, just to observe them. And again, no oxygen needs, and the length of stay for these mild cases are less than half of what was for Delta-related cases. Cytokine storm, we don't really see that at the primary healthcare level. However, again, still early days regarding what's happening at ICU level. So we are quite comfortable that the average patient in primary healthcare that we are examining on a day-to-day basis and that comes into our surgeries, the average person will recover within 5 to maximum 7 days. And we haven't encountered so far long COVID with these specific patients. We're not talking about patients in ICU.
Thank you. And as well as being chair of the South African Medical Association, you're a doctor in clinical practice. And I think it was that practice that led you first to suspect that there might be a new variant. Just perhaps summarise very briefly how you came to that thought.
Thank you so much. I always say I'm an old GP, 33 years in private practice, and still old school, do not go on the social media or the Zoom platform or Health ID. I normally see my patients physically, 600 plus patients with Delta that I have treated personally myself. And then we had this break from Delta. And about 8 weeks later, patients come back in with complaints that didn't make any sense at all. Young patient, early in the morning, doesn't fit and tested. He was positive. Incidentally, his whole family made an appointment. That's also something unusual in our system. And the rest of the family was positive. And that day I saw this mild picture. And the picture predominantly for the past 4 weeks stays exactly the same. The 3 major complaints will be myalgia, what we will call sore muscles or body ache and pain, headache, as well as there can be a bit of a fatigue for a day or two. Normally the patients will come because we run a campaign where we ask people, please get tested, even if you wake up with a slight headache, not feeling well, please come and let us double check. Consequently, we have noticed that if you wake up this morning and you have this headache and the myalgia, it would be prudent just to wait 24 hours especially for the rapid test. We have seen the rapid test can be still false negative in that first period, less than 24 hours. But after 24 hours, up until about 5 to 6 days later, the rapid test are more than sufficient, to be able to detect positive cases. We do, however, have patients that wait up until a week, then come in and says they're not sure, they just need to double check. They had this headache, not feeling well. Can we just double check? And then we will do a PCR, and normally that will be positive. So the symptoms are very similar for most of the patients. However, as well, unvaccinated patients seems to experience the severity of the myalgia as well as the headache more intense than our vaccinated patients. And yes, we do see nearly the same amount of patients who have been vaccinated versus unvaccinated with mild disease. Although, as I've said, it seems that the vaccinated people even recover quicker than your unvaccinated people.
Thank you very much indeed. Finally from me, before I turn to my colleagues, starting with Erin Bell. Given the experience of the last few weeks in South Africa, have any new restrictions, let's say non-pharmaceutical interventions, been taken by the South African government in response to Omicron?
No, we are still on the same level where there are restrictions at curfews at night and in early mornings, and then the gathering of people in outdoors and indoors, and nothing changed there. So we will wait this weekend to see whether our president, who incidentally also have contracted COVID, and we're quite sure it's Omicron, whether he would bring in any stricter restrictions. For now, it's already spread to all the other provinces, so interprovincial travel is not really going to do anything. And then again, from the South African Medical Association side, if there's anything that we would advise the president to do, would be maybe extend the curfew with it just 1 hour at night and in the morning, and look at the social gatherings. I've been asked this question a lot of times, what will the government do? What are they going to do against restrictions? And my question is the same the whole time. The government can provide you with vaccines. They can tell you to get vaccinated. The government can give, they can bring in certain regulations. But what are you as a responsible citizen going to do? You as a responsible citizen needs to adhere to these regulations and the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And you as a responsible citizen actually need to go and get your vaccines, because we have seen that the vaccines, it really seems at this stage that it still, although there's a escape of the vaccines, still protect you against severe disease. And we see that in our hospital cases that is lying in ICU.
Thank you. You're chair of the South African Medical Association. Does that view as to what should be done, is that, would you say, a view widely shared by the association, or is there a kind of hot debate about this?
So this is, I normally consult with my board regarding this. And then also, if you look at what is happening at ground level, and the cases are predominantly mild, and we don't have a problem in the family practitioner space, as well as in the hospitals, then we don't see the need for stricter restrictions. There's an economic downfall to it as well. And again, people as I've said, there's no use putting any restrictions around movement, because the virus is everywhere. And, maybe in a way we need to learn how to live with this. And if this becomes sort of endemic going forward, we need to get as much people, if they are infected, the boost of their antibodies, as well as getting the boosters themselves to be able to help and assist here.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll turn to my colleague Aaron Bell and then take some more colleagues.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Kutsia, for coming on today. And thank you also for your willingness to engage with the UK media, because it's been quite helpful for us to hear your experiences from South Africa here. On that note, you've written in the Daily Mail today, you've said that you've been astonished by the extraordinary worldwide reaction. You've said, with respect to Britain, that the reaction is out of all proportion to the risks posed by this variant, and you've said it verges on hysteria. Could you explain why you believe that, given that the countries in Europe have a very different population structure, a different exposure, we haven't had a beta wave and so on? Isn't it the case that countries in Europe are just taking a precautionary approach for a few weeks until we know more?
Yes, if you look at the current picture in the primary healthcare space in South Africa is that of mild disease. We said right from the beginning, we don't have all the answers. We still need to see how this virus progresses, what would be the clinical pictures, and less than 24 hours, we were slammed from the UK with international travel bans. While we were trying to say, please guys, there's a new variant out there. And at that stage, we already at family practitioners level had a 1 week, 7 days experience when this happened. And we were still figuring it out as well. But already during that time, saw that the symptoms are definitely not the same than Delta. And, to bring out a international travel ban in less than 24 hours after some announcement that's done, we do now understand that governments wants to protect their population and their people. But, before you start doing these type of knee-jerk reactions, let's first get your, people to start wearing their masks, look at social distancing, look at your gatherings of people, and just try to start with the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And then simultaneously identify your people who are at high risk. If they need second or boosters, get them to do the boosters. Or if they have not been vaccinated, just get them to vaccinate. I think that's much better protection, especially seeing in the light of this variant that is mild. So what will happen is you will test me today with remember what I've said with the especially the rapid test. I will come in, I won't feel that sick. You will test me, I will be negative. And only tomorrow will I be positive. So if I travel and I've done my test, and I've done it early, before I really have any real symptoms, I would test negative. And by the time I end up in another country, I might be testing positive.
Yes. And
with a virus that's such transmissible, you will in any case spread it. So, it's difficult to stop it.
Yeah, I think given that community transmission is now widespread, I think the case for travel bans is probably changed. But if I could go back to what you said in the article again today, you said it's completely over the top to be talking about Plan Cs or lockdowns. What we're voting on today in the House of Commons isn't Plan C or a lockdown. It's essentially extending the requirement to wear masks, which you just mentioned, and also this COVID pass, some people calling it a vaccine passport, but also negative tests will allow you to get into larger events. Do you think that's a proportionate reaction in the UK?
Just at the crucial point, Dr. Kutsia is frozen there. I don't know whether she seems to be back. Dr. Kutsia, did you hear the question from my colleague Aaron Bell?
The last part I didn't.
Let me ask,
and then I didn't hear.
Let me ask Aaron to ask it again in summary form.
I'll go from the start. Thank you, Chair. And sorry, we just lost you for a moment, Dr. Kutsia. You said in the article you wrote today that it's completely over the top to be talking about Plan Cs or lockdowns. But what we're voting on today in the House of Commons is not a lockdown or even Plan C. It's an extension of the mask mandate, which you've already mentioned. And there's this COVID pass, some people calling it a vaccine passport, but either vaccination or a negative lateral flow test or a recent recovery from COVID will enable you to get into larger venues. Do you think that's a proportionate reaction to the threat of Omicron in the UK?
So what I think what is important to do is first get your people to be vaccinated as much as, you know, and as I've said with the boosters, that's necessary. Get the people to wear their masks. Get the people to stay away from big gatherings. That should be the biggest plan at this stage to have in place, and not to, you know, come in and you know, the restrictions first, you know, close all the borders, close shops and all of that. So, you know, first look at what is going to happen with your age population. You might have a different population at South Africa, but also remember, even in South Africa, we have people not vaccinated, young people, most of them not vaccinated, with severe diseases like HIV and TB. We've got a huge burden of that. And we also know that a lot of these people also didn't get their treatment. They didn't adhere, especially during this past year with treatment. So rather get people treated with the comorbidities, make sure that they follow the protocols, get your non-pharmaceutical interventions, and then you start looking, you know, how much are your systems or your healthcare system being overburdened by people. Always remember, you will have the worried well as well. But for us, the most important place to look at is what happens in the hospital level, because there's what the problem should, you know, where the problem will, if anything will happen, it will happen at tertiary hospitals. And there you need to plan, you need to make sure that everything is in place there. People that were supposed to go on leave maybe be on standby. That would help much more than bringing in just blanket restrictions going forward.
Thank you. Could I just ask you about severity? You said it presents much milder. There's some data out this morning from the South African Medical Research Council together with Discovery, which is a South African insurance company, suggesting that severity is 29% lower than the original D614G wave. Is that a figure that makes sense to you, that it's milder than the original first wave by about 29%?
I think we may have temporarily lost Dr. Kutsia again. Let's see if we can get her back. Yes. Did you hear the question,
yes.
Dr. Kutsia? Yep.
Yes. Yes.
So
yes, it makes sense to us.
About 29% milder, right. And then also that same data, but the data that's been published said that a double dose of Pfizer, so not the booster, which most of our elderly have been boosted in the UK, but a double dose of Pfizer, instead of 80% protection against infection, you're down to 33%, and instead of 93% protection against severe disease, you're down to 70%. Is it, again, are those numbers that make sense based on the South African experience as you've seen it?
Oh, we now seem to have lost Dr. Kutsia altogether. She's back. Let's just have one more try at that. Did you hear the question, Dr. Kutsia?
Can I shut down my video camera?
Yes, see if it's better audio. Yes, please do that. Absolutely.
Did you hear the question, Dr. Kutsia?
Thank you. I think this is much better.
Yes, we can hear you.
Just repeat it quickly.
Sorry, just finally, the same data that was published this morning had information about the effectiveness of a double dose of Pfizer, but not with a booster, which most of our elderly have had. The two figures I wanted to put to you were the reduction in effectiveness against infection, 80% from Delta down to only 33% against Omicron, and for hospital admissions down from 93% effectiveness against Delta, only 70% with Omicron. Are those numbers that you recognise from your experience in South Africa?
So what we have seen, if I look at my own stats of the patient, I had seen personally 88 patients. So the vaccinated patients, 39 versus unvaccinated patients, 43. So yes, we know that the patients get breakthrough infections, whether you're vaccinated or you get reinfected as well, or patients who had been reinfected before or had been infected before and fully vaccinated, they can still get breakthrough infections. However, the breakthrough infections that we are seeing at primary healthcare level are mild, those of mildness. And again, the symptoms experienced by these people or patients are less severe or intense than the unvaccinated. On the hospital level, where patients are admitted, as I've said before, the majority, between 88 to 90% are unvaccinated. So the question would be, and that is why it's so important for us to understand the vaccinated group in the hospitals, whether they do have, had they had Omicron or Delta before, so that we can determine how well the vaccines are protecting you against these two variants. But we don't have that data.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much indeed, Darren. We'll try Dawn Butler. We're reaching the limits of the bandwidth here, but Dawn, perhaps some short questions that might get through.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kutsia. How many weeks has it been since you discovered Omicron variant?
On Thursday, it would be 4 weeks.
4 weeks, brilliant. And can you just tell us, please, what's the population in South Africa that have been vaccinated?
It would be 4 weeks. 2 days from now.
Brilliant, thank you. And what is the population that have been vaccinated, the percentage, please, and the percentage of the population that have had a booster jab in South Africa?
So the percentage in South Africa that has been vaccinated is around about 23%. The boosters, we haven't started with the boosters for Pfizer yet. We will start with that. And with Johnson & Johnson, we started last month with the boosters, and quite a few of those doctors and healthcare workers has been vaccinated. So the fully vaccinated under the Sesonke trial, Sesonke 2, that's the healthcare workers, is around about 200,000 that already has been vaccinated with their second or with their booster on Sesonke, on Johnson & Johnson. And fully vaccinated in South Africa, we had under the age groups that we have been allocated is 38%, and that have been vaccinated. So there's still a lot of people, as I have said. In the total, 23% of our population has been vaccinated.
Right, thank you very much. I know that South Africa's quite advanced in genome sequencing. It has been said that the variant was in Europe before you discovered it in South Africa. Is that correct?
Can't comment on that. I didn't saw the stats, and it could have been anywhere. I think if you take UK as an example, you have seen so many Delta cases that you can easily miss this light picture at primary healthcare level, and it could be in any other country. So I don't think there's anyone that can claim that it was first started in their country. I don't think so.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question, if it was correct to say that it started in South Africa. And my last question, please, and thank you very much for your time today. Do you do any antibody testing or T-cell testing in South Africa?
We don't do it routinely. that is done at scientist level and not routinely. And the T-cell antibodies, I know it's quite a difficult field, and it's an expensive field. So this is one of the things I think what one needs to look going forward is to make sure that there are more investment in science as to improve the healthcare, and especially in studies around T-cell immunity, as well as your normal antibodies. Unfortunately, with what we have seen with the COVID, is that your antibodies, instead of taking 6 months to get your IgG positive, it can get positive within 2 to 3 weeks. So it's very difficult. And then the antibody test is not really going to tell you how good your T-cell immunity are. So I think there's a need for this field, and I think there's a need for science to be reimbursed and for trials to be conducted here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kutsia. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. Just a final question from me. Perhaps I could just follow up an answer, Dr. Kutsia, you gave to my colleague Aaron Bell. He was asking you about lockdown restrictions, non-pharmaceutical interventions, as they're called. Am I recalling what you said correctly, which you said that you'd be against restrictions that might be a lockdown, but that people should avoid crowded places? Have I captured that correctly?
Yes, you captured it correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so the proposal one of the proposals before the House of Commons today is that in larger venues, people should either have to demonstrate a negative lateral flow test or to show that they've been double vaccinated. What's your assessment of those proposed measures?
Well, it can help and it can assist a lot. Unfortunately, I'm coming from South Africa, where we know how easy it is to counterfeit anything. And so as long as you have checks and balances and checks in place to make sure that it's original passports or mandates being shown at wherever you require them, that might work. But again, there's always people that would look on how they can fool the system. So you have to have a foolproof system there.
Thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful to you for joining us from South Africa this morning and persevering despite the technical difficulties. We managed to get your answers to all of our questions. So thank you very much indeed for joining us and helping us in this important session this morning. I'm now going to invite our next witness to give evidence to the committee. And I'm pleased to welcome Professor Wei-Shen Lim. Professor Lim is the chair of the COVID-19 panel of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Professor Lim, thank you very much indeed. And again, you've helped the committee several times with our inquiry, and we're very grateful for your appearance today. Perhaps I can start off with a question about timings. Boosters were authorised by the JCVI, or at least JCVI gave a recommendation that they should be authorised for all adults, and I think on the 29th of November. What stopped that recommended authorisation being earlier?
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me all right.
We can. And see you.
Thank you. Could I just make a slight maybe correction? So boosters were advised by JCVI for people aged 50 years and above on the 14th of September.
Indeed.
And for people 60 to 49 years old who are in the clinical risk group, also on the 14th of September. And then boosters were advised for people aged 40 to 49-year-olds on the 15th of November.
Yes. So my question was that I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, the case that for all adults it was the 29th of November. Is that correct?
So for adults under 40, that came in on the 29th of November.
Indeed. So that's my question. Could that recommendation have come earlier?
It could, but I don't think it would have been appropriate to come earlier. We set out on the 29th of November a set of advice as immediate response measures to Omicron. Omicron was identified by a lab in South Africa on the 23rd of November. It was declared as a variant of concern by WHO on the 26th of November. JCBI met as a committee on the 27th of November in the evening, that was a Saturday, and on the 29th of November, 3 days after WHO declared it as a variant of concern, we advised a set of immediate response measures, one of which was to accelerate the booster campaign across the board. So the acceleration of the booster campaign came 3 days after this was recognized by WHO as a variant of concern. We could have potentially called it earlier, 2 days earlier, but I don't think we could have called it before Omicron was identified.
I see. So I guess the heart of the question is, obviously, as you described, you responded very quickly once we knew that Omicron was circulating, starting in South Africa. But the decision to give boosters to over 50s, as you said, happened on the 14th of September, before anyone had ever heard of Omicron, probably before it was even in existence. So there was, I assume in your minds, a set of anticipation of preempting during the winter a variant or a susceptibility to infection by people that had been vaccinated twice. So the question is, would it have been better, now looking back, to have, as a precaution, used the autumn to vaccinate with a booster the whole population, rather than waiting for evidence of a dangerous new strain?
The simple answer is no. So the decision in September to offer vaccination to people over 50, for example, was based on the Delta variant, which is circulating, and the amount of waning of protection against severe disease. The data from the UK Health Security Agency showed that there was starting to be some waning against severe disease, this is hospitalization and people sadly dying, from about 6 months onwards, particularly in the older people. The data for waning against severe disease for younger people who are otherwise well, so not in the clinical risk group, remains very good against Delta up to 6 months. So they have over 90% protection against severe disease, even 6 months from their second dose. Therefore, insofar as protection against Delta is necessary, we only need to boost people whose protection are waning. And we identified those in September. Your question about hindsight or foresight is different from foreknowledge. Foresight is trying to identify something that will transpire given a set of circumstances. Foreknowledge is prophetic knowledge of something that didn't exist that will then exist. The booster campaign for Omicron is a response to the threat of Omicron, and that needs a different way of thinking.
A very important distinction. And so thinking of foresight and foreknowledge, what would have been the downside of vaccinating during the autumn the whole adult population in anticipation of the possibility that there might be presenting itself during the winter something worrying like Omicron? What would have been the downside of doing it in anticipation?
As you know, the protection does wane, and we've seen that with the older population. So at any points that we give a vaccine or a booster, we will see an improvement in the level of protection But potentially we then see that level of protection dip over time. And therefore, one doesn't want to give boosters unnecessarily too early, because if you already have good protection at one point in time, there's no point giving extra protection at that time. It's better to wait for the appropriate time so that you extend your durability. As I explained in September when we launched the booster program, we were not thinking only about this winter, we're thinking also about next winter. So putting aside Omicron and just thinking about Delta, if somebody only needs to have a booster at 6 months, then giving the booster at 6 months might mean that their protection then lasts for much longer. If the booster were given at 3 months, for instance, one, it will wane earlier, and secondly, a shorter time to boost might mean a lower peak protection, which also has an effect on durability. So it's not necessarily true that giving a booster sooner is better. If anything, all things being equal, giving a booster as far apart as possible gives the best immune response. And so one would want to choose a furthest time point, if one can, depending on the amount of waning.
Thank you. That's very clear. And just finally on this, suppose one did, as a precaution, give a booster earlier than might have been optimal. Would there be any problem with then supplementing that with a fourth dose in the spring if that had waned by consequence in the spring rather than in the summer?
I think we're looking not just at one vaccine, we're looking across the board at the effort to give a vaccine. As you heard from Dame Kate earlier on, the cost of deploying a vaccine in the vaccine program is extremely high, almost as high as procuring the vaccine. And deploying millions of doses of vaccine has a cost on services, on GP's time, and many other things, much not least on the public effort. So I don't think it's if you will, a free ride to give a vaccine once and give it again very quickly thereafter. All of these need to be considered in terms of their wider effects as well.
Would you accept that the costs of vaccines and administering them, while significant, pale into insignificance against the cost of the incidence of waves of infection and perhaps hospitalization that they might prevent?
That's only if you know that something like Omicron was occurring. So you could take the precautionary principle and say, I am not going to chart or look at the amount of waning. I'm simply going to give a vaccine in 3 months because there might be a variant occurring at 4 months' time. And after 3 months, I might again give another vaccine boost at a further 3 months because a variant hasn't appeared, but there might be a variant coming in the next 4 months. And that could go on the whole year, giving a booster every 3 months because you don't know if a variant is going to occur 4 months later. I can't see that that is a sustainable program for the country going into just 1 year, much less a few years.
Although if the alternative is 3 monthly impositions of restrictions, that also has its downsides, I think you'd accept as well.
I would, but as I said, you only impose or consider imposing the restrictions if there is a variant. Whereas what you're suggesting is that you might want to give boosters every 3 months just in case, not knowing if you ever need boosters every 3 months at all. So this is on the off chance of a variant occurring or emerging that would require widespread social restrictions. and we haven't reached that point yet either.
Indeed. Well, we'll go further into detail, and I'm very grateful for the clarity of your answers on this. I'll go to Carol Monaghan and then Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Lim, you've talked about giving boosters every 3 months, and I maybe understood you wrongly, so you can correct me if this is the case. Did you say that if we start giving boosters more frequently, there will be a quicker waning of antibodies? So we would require to give boosters more frequently?
No, I didn't say that at all. The principle is that if you have a bigger gap between 2 doses, you're likely to get a higher immune response. And you might remember back in December last year, the UK decided to extend the interval between dose 1 and dose 2 to 12 weeks rather than 3 to 4 weeks. In that year, we now have data to show that by extending the interval between the 2 doses, one gets a stronger, i.e. a higher immune response. The level of waning is affected by the peak immune response. So if the level that is attained after the second dose is higher, one hopes that therefore the duration of protection is longer. Similarly, for a booster dose, if a 6-month booster gives a higher level of protection than a 3-month boost, then when you start to wane from a higher level, it takes longer to wane. The second way of extending the protection is simply that if you give a booster at 6 months rather than 3 months, then you've already gained 3 months, and so you extend your total level of protection. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense, but you're saying that if you give the booster too soon, it will wane more quickly.
So that is indeed might be the case. So if you give the booster at 6 months and you reach a higher level, so let's give a number, say you reach a level of 200 and that wanes at a certain constant rate, then to drop from 200 to 50 will take a certain period of time. If you give the booster at 3 months and the peak level it can get to is lower, say 150, and it wanes at the same rate, you will reach 50 at an earlier time point.
So that would then necessitate more regular boosters.
Indeed, and that's why generally, if possible, we try and push out the duration between 2 doses.
Okay, so now the JCVI is offering a booster to everyone over the age of 18, and this interval has been shortened now to 3 months. So what evidence was that based upon?
Yeah, so the current booster campaign and the interval is not based on waning, it's because of the threat of Omicron. And the principle here is that if you give a booster, you get a high immune response. And we think that a high immune response is what is needed to bridge the gap of the mismatch between the new variant, Omicron, and the vaccine strain, which was based on the wild type or Wuhan variant. So you need a higher level, hence the booster. The second principle for the booster campaign for Omicron is that you want to give the booster before the wave comes. There is less benefit in giving a booster in the middle of a wave or after a wave. So we want to bring the booster dose earlier if we think the wave is going to come earlier. When we looked at this as soon as Omicron was declared, we felt that there was a high chance that the Omicron wave will come soon. And therefore, we want to bring forward the booster dose so that it occurs before the wave.
Okay,
we chose
which
3 months
seems...
because we have data from a trial to show that at 3 months from the second dose, the boost still gives a very high immune response.
Okay, so this was a precautionary, this is a precautionary booster then in order to preempt this wave? And
yes, that's right.
And so for example, I had my booster on Friday. When should I need another booster?
We don't know that. If you had your booster on Friday, which is excellent, it would take about a week for you to have the full benefit from that booster dose. That's how we estimate the peak protection from the boost. But it's too soon now to advise when the next booster needs to be given.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lim. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jeremy Hunt and then Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Professor Lim. I mean, you were acclaimed, JCVI and the MHRA were acclaimed around the world for being the most nimble regulators anywhere when a year and a week ago exactly we gave the first clinically approved vaccine to any patient anywhere in the world. And you didn't have foreknowledge, for example, of all the possible side effects, of which there turned out to be one or two, but you made a balanced judgment that it was right to proceed. Israel made that same balanced judgment that it was right to proceed with booster jabs for all adults in September. Now, you've made that judgment now. With the benefit of hindsight, Israel was right, weren't they, and we were wrong?
No, I'm sorry, I would disagree, as you would expect me to. We judged that the most vulnerable people should be boosted. If you look at the booster campaign data from Israel, the protection that they obtained from the booster in terms of preventing hospitalization and people dying against Delta, which is what we were facing with then, was almost entirely in people above 40 years of age. So we went down to 40 years of age, and we had not excluded the possibility of boosting people under 40 years, but in September, there were not that many people under 40 years of age who were healthy, who were yet 6 months from their second dose anyway. And the data we had was that they have very good protection for 6 months, over 90% protection. So we were going in a useful and
I'm just struggling. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just struggling. My wife is getting her booster this morning. She's under 50. Omicron transmission is 200,000 a day. And you're really saying that it would have made no difference if you had given the instruction to give the boosters to under 50s earlier, as they did in Israel. It seems to me, as a non-scientist, totally obvious that it would have been better if we'd had those instructions earlier, with the benefit of hindsight. That's all I'm asking.
I don't think you can predict that a variant like Omicron would have emerged.
Well, they did in Israel. They made a precautionary judgment. Let me ask another one. We have had for the whole autumn very high transmission rates in schools. And that's one of the reasons that our death rates have continued to be consistently around the 100 mark or above during the autumn. Now France made a balanced judgment to vaccinate teenagers in June. You refused to make that judgment even in September. In the end, we had to sort of do a workaround using the chief medical officers. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, didn't France get that balanced judgment right, and weren't we wrong?
I think with the benefit of extra data, then we would have moved earlier, but we didn't have the extra data on safety.
They didn't have that data in France either. That's why. Okay, let me give you another one then. America's already made a decision that it's safe to vaccinate the over 5s with Pfizer. We haven't made a decision yet. Again, I suppose the question I'm really asking, having been the most nimble in the world and receive plaudits everywhere for being fleet of foot. Can you understand why people are worried that not just yourselves, but with the MHRA, our regulators have been dragging their feet and therefore putting the NHS at greater risk this winter than it might otherwise have been?
I've been asked that question before, and if you look at the different decisions that have been made, there is a time, I believe, to be extra fast, and there's a time to move extra cautiously. We've moved very quickly at the start when there was a need to. We moved very quickly when Alpha emerged and we needed to change the advice. And we've moved very quickly when Omicron emerged and we've changed our advice. So where we need to move very quickly, we will do so. Where we feel that we do not want to outpace the data for safety reasons, we feel we will do so. Both of these obviously are judgments as to how quickly one moves. We have made out those judgments based on the best available information.
Thank you. Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. Hiya, Professor Lim. Thanks very much for your time and brilliant answers as usual. I just want to go back to something that maybe people in the community are talking about more so than the kind of the science advice. So it's not unusual for me to have heard, oh, I had it back in June, I had it back in July, I was COVID positive, I don't need a booster for a while. Could you perhaps talk about the assessment that you're making of previous infection and how that plays into the need for boosters for a given individual? And then I might follow that up in a broader scale.
Thanks. That's a very good question because, as you say, it is being discussed by a lot of people. And if we look firstly at the laboratory data on antibodies, for example, what is found is that somebody who has had prior infection and then has one dose of vaccine, their immune response after the one dose is actually very, very good and almost similar to somebody having 2 doses of the vaccine. The same is also true for somebody who has had prior infection and then has 2 doses of the vaccine. Their immune response is similar to somebody who has had 3 doses of the vaccine. So what is happening with natural infection is that on recovery from natural infection, an immune response, protective immune response is generated. And that appears to act almost like a vaccine-generated immune response. It's called natural immunity compared to vaccine-induced immunity. So somebody who has been infected once, the data from the first wave and some of the second wave show that those people are protected from reinfection for a long period of time, just from natural immunity.
Could you enumerate that long period? Because in effect, what a natural infection is doing is giving a kind of, you know, we've been talking in the previous session about Valneva as a whole attenuated vaccine producing a much stronger immune response. If you've actually had it and got over it, how long can you be confident that you are protected for?
The data suggests that protection is about 6 months at least. The studies don't go too far out beyond that for natural infection. But I just want to draw attention to the difference with Omicron. In general, if you just take people who've had previous infection and no vaccines whatsoever, if you measure their immune response, it is lower than somebody who's had 2 doses of vaccine. With Omicron, there is concern that there is a much lower protection from natural immunity alone, i.e. if somebody's had previous infection and not had any vaccines whatsoever, that whereas they would have been reasonably well protected for, say, alpha or wild-type vaccine in the past, they may not be quite so well protected when it comes to Omicron.
So if I made the following statement, having had it prior, Omicron is a game changer even if you feel you have immunity from prior infection, and it is still important that you take up the offer of a booster.
Exactly. Yes, that is absolutely right. That's the current thinking.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a couple of final questions. Just going back to our conversation earlier. You talked about the cost of a vaccine programme, both the vaccines themselves and the work incurred in vaccinating people. Does the JCVI consider cost, the cost effectiveness in making its decisions, or is it entirely in terms of clinical effectiveness?
At the moment, usually we would consider cost effectiveness, but we've not considered cost effectiveness because the vaccine procurement has been occurring on a different level.
So in terms of the decision, the timing of the decisions, was the cost of vaccination a factor that was considered in not proceeding with earlier vaccination, or was that entirely on clinical grounds?
You need to just maybe I can ask some clarification. When you say not proceeding, we've never made a decision not to proceed. We've been looking at when to offer vaccinations rather than when not to.
Well, what I mean is...
what are you referring to?
So, as you pointed out, on the 14th of September, there was a recommendation that over 50s and vulnerable groups get vaccinated, but not people under 50. So was the decision not to recommend that under 50s were vaccinated from the 14th of September, was that partly at least a consideration of the costs of so doing?
No, it's because over 50s were the group that we felt needed a booster at the time, and other people didn't need a booster at the time.
Indeed, so it was entirely on clinical grounds. Thank you. My final question was just going back to one of the points that my colleague Jeremy Hunt made about a decision that the US has taken to vaccinate now children from the age of 5. When might an assessment be made by the JCVI of the desirability of doing that in the UK?
We are discussing that at the moment. We're also waiting for the vaccines to be approved by MHRA.
Right. So would you expect to make a decision before Christmas on that?
I would expect so. We try and keep in step with the approval process.
Right. And do you have any insight as to when the MHRA might make that assessment?
I don't think I should be trying to double guess when they might do that.
But that is you say you're considering it, so that is the next decision, and it's a live decision. It's you're contemplating it now. Okay, thank you very much.
Indeed, yes.
I think Dawn Butler had a question that she wanted to come in on.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick question, Dr. Lim. We need to prepare for future pandemics and epidemics. How can we best do that?
Well, that's a very broad question. There are all sorts of ways where we need to do that and how we need to do that. It ranges from surveillance mechanisms to science to public education. Was there a specific area that you were thinking about?
I was thinking about how we manufacture vaccines and ensuring that we have control of that rather than big pharmaceutical companies, number one, so that we'll be able to not just vaccinate people but share the vaccine, so it's not on profit but on keeping people well. And the second thing in relation to where we are now in regards to this current pandemic is the boosting up of the testing of antibodies and T cells.
I am not probably the right person to talk about vaccine manufacturing. As a general principle, if if you have control over manufacturing, that's always better. But as Dame Kate has mentioned, it may be better if that's based in the UK. Again, that's outside my area of expertise, so I'm not going to discuss where manufacturing should occur. In terms of the testing of immunological responses, yes, absolutely. The better we are at doing that, the better the science. And it's not just vaccines or immunology, it's also other therapeutics and interventions. All of this is going to be important as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Lim.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Lim, thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. These are very important and I'm sure in some cases difficult decisions, and what we want to do is to understand some of the thinking behind it, and you've been very clear and very candid about that, and we're very grateful for your evidence today, but also for your work chairing the panel. So thank you for that. I'm going to now turn to our next witness, who I see has joined us on the screen. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Burton, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Moderna. Dr. Burton is appearing virtually from Boston in the east coast of the United States, where I think it must be shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning, and it looks dark outside. So thank you for getting up especially early to appear before us this morning. Just to kick off the questions, obviously the committee and indeed the UK Parliament today is considering Omicron and the response to it. How effective is a booster dose of Moderna against Omicron in your, according to your research?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and committee members, thank you for having me today. It's a privilege to be here and to be able to talk on behalf of Moderna. Look, I think it's clearly a key question. It's one that we still don't absolutely have the answer to. I think it's one that data will begin to come in over the next few days. I was listening to Professor Lin earlier. I think what we know is that Omicron, because of the 51 different mutations, 30 of them in the spike protein alone, we know that many antibodies do not bind as effectively to Omicron as they do to prior variants. I think what we're also seeing from data that is coming out of different laboratories around the world is that is holding up, whereas people vaccinated with a variety of different antibodies were able to neutralize Delta variant, the originator COVID virus, even some months after being vaccinated. That does not appear to be the same with Omicron. So I think we have to wait for further data to come out. My guess, though, is that for people who have now been vaccinated some time ago with any type of vaccine, and Moderna vaccine included, that their immunity will have waned. But the data that we see again, time and time again, and I would go back to Dr. Faust's data, the COVE Boost study published recently in Lancet, conducted in the UK, showed that giving a booster of the Moderna vaccine, and we have seen this from multiple other studies around the world, very effectively increases antibody levels and very effectively enhances vaccine effectiveness. Again, certainly to the originator strain and to all of the other variants of concern as well. So while I think we still need some data to come in, I would be confident that we will be able to boost up the levels of antibody with the Moderna booster, either at the 50 microgram boost dose or indeed at the 100 microgram enhanced level that we use in immunocompromised people.
I see. And when do you expect that data to be available in sufficient depth to be able to make an assessment?
I think we're looking at days now. There are labs around the world. My R&D colleagues are running those experiments in collaboration with different laboratories around the world, including in the United Kingdom. And our feeling is that those will be in the next few days. They're difficult experiments to do. They have to be done very carefully and the data analyzed carefully, but I think they're imminent.
Thank you. This committee has taken evidence before and has heard that before Omicron was identified and indeed suspected, that the course of a virus like COVID is that it is going to find ways to evade vaccines in terms of transmission, but the evidence that we heard was that it is likely to, the vaccines are likely to protect against severe disease. Is that a kind of general characterization that you would recognize and would accord to your expectations?
Yes, I do. I think that's a good characterization of the natural history of the viruses and then what the vaccines are able to do. And with our platform, we're trying to estimate what are the key variants of this virus and then make newer vaccines in the future that will combine those so that we try and get protection against them. But yes, your summary is, I think, very correct.
And so, given that, if Omicron outcompetes Delta in transmissibility, and we're seeing some early evidence that it is essentially crowding it out and it's becoming dominant, if a less severe variant in terms of its effect on health replaces one that is more severe, over time, does this amount to some cause for kind of optimism rather than despair? I don't want to look for silver linings where there are none, but would that, as a hypothesis, how do you assess that?
I think there are a couple of things. I think broadly, yes. If we could have a far less dangerous COVID virus, SARS-2 COVID virus, that would be a good thing. I actually do not think that Omicron is a milder, less severe version of the current virus. I also think that the idea that essentially it will push Delta out of the way and take over may occur in the future, but I think certainly in the coming months, these two viruses are going to coexist. And Omicron, which again I would maintain is actually a severe disease, will now infect people on a background of very, very strong Delta pressure. It will also lead to a situation where individuals will become, and there's certainly documented evidence of this from earlier variants and infections, where individuals will become co-infected, which gives the opportunity for these viruses to further evolve and mutate, which is a concerning and worrying situation. So, look, I think if we could get to a situation with a far less milder virus, that would be a good thing. I don't think it's going to occur in the near future. So I think we certainly don't have to panic. We have many, many tools at our disposal. We've learned so much about this virus over the last 2 years. And we can continue to fight it, but I think Omicron poses a real threat.
Let me just, before I turn to colleagues, just probe a little on that. So you said something very important, which is that you don't think that Omicron is likely to be or is less severe than Delta. Tell me why that's your view.
I think there are a few pieces of evidence. It's concerning, Dr. Lin mentioned this. People who have been infected with Delta typically do not get reinfected with Delta. We know, and you just asked me about this, we know from the data that Omicron evades antibodies. Omicron is quite capable. Data from South Africa recently showed that Omicron is quite capable of reinfecting people who have already been infected with Delta. I think that's concerning. The doubling time at 3 days is far faster than we have seen with prior variants of concern. I think the data from Denmark over the last few days also now show that the hospitalization rates with Omicron are, not dissimilar, in fact, even numerically slightly higher than what we've seen with Delta. Those data are still early, but that is concerning. And when you look at the data in South Africa, which is well collected and published daily, about 15% of people who are hospitalized are in the intensive care unit. And while there's variability, if you look back earlier in the year, at the time of real Delta surge in August, those numbers are about the same, 15%. So while the mortality rate right now that we're seeing is mercifully lower, I think as a disease, it's a very fit virus, and it has, it's severe.
And finally, just something you said, you talked about dual infection. You mean people could be simultaneously infected with Delta and Omicron? Was that the meaning of that?
Yes, there's certainly data. There's been some papers published, again, from South Africa earlier in the course of the pandemic, where people, certainly immunocompromised people, can harbour both viruses, and that would be possible here, particularly given the pressure, the number of infections that we're seeing now.
And is the consequence of that, as it were, more than the sum of its parts? Is if you have both together, is that much worse than each?
It certainly could be. I think that's what we'll begin to understand, and it certainly gives an opportunity for the two viruses to what we call recombinate. They can now begin to share genes and swap genes over. So the biology around Omicron and the situation we're in, given the Delta pressure right now, is really important to think about.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Aaron Ben, then Deanna Davison.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Burton. Just following up from that, you suggest that there could well be co-circulation of Delta and Omicron, and we don't know that Omicron is, even though it's much more transmissible, is ultimately going to displace Delta. Given that the Delta prior infection doesn't give you that much protection against Omicron, what do you think the likelihood of the reverse is? Will being infected with Omicron give you protection against Delta or other variants?
It's a great question. I think the best answer I can give you is it might do. We know that Delta harbors a variety of mutations seen in the other variants of concern, alpha, beta, gamma, and Delta. And so it could be that people who are then infected with Omicron could get some degree of protection against the other variants, but I think we have to wait and see.
I know colleagues are going to ask about a variant-specific vaccine, but is the implication that we might need multivalent vaccines or vaccines that target something different, given the possibility of co-circulating variants?
Yes, I think, again, at Moderna, we have talked about this. My colleagues in the R&D organization are working on these. We had published some data over the summer from a multivalent candidate that covers both the original strain and beta. I think the issue is going to be trying to understand how we can kind of outsmart and predict where the variants will go in the future, and then being able to be prepared to produce and manufacture those vaccines in time. But yes, I think to really get past this phase of the pandemic, we will need those types of vaccines.
And just finally from me, following from what you just said, was the extent to which Omicron was different to Delta a surprise?
I think it was. I mean, I'm certainly not a vaccine expert, but talking to colleagues who are and to reading reports from other people around the world in the United Kingdom, I think the extent of the mutations, the evolutionary shift that it made, and the potential for the severity of those mutations was surprising to many people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deanna Davison, then Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Burton, for being so open with us today. I just want to touch on the point about sort of variant-specific vaccines. Clearly, this is something that you guys are currently investigating to try and come up with something that's even more effective against Omicron. Can you just explain to us how that process works? And then I want to come on to the sort of regulatory side after.
The platform that Moderna has is essentially able to take different pieces of mRNA and combine them into a single lipid nanoparticle. The company was founded 10 years ago. It's developed extremely safe and effective lipid nanoparticles, and it's perfected the ability to bring these pieces of messenger RNA together. We can give high amounts of mRNA. These are then, as we know, injected into your arm somewhere. They are taken up by the cell, and then the cell produces the protein that the messenger RNA tells it to produce, and it produces it exactly like your body would. So it's very reproducible, it's very predictable, and we manufacture the mRNA. So rather than the process becoming the product, as people talk about, in years gone by, this really is a very predictable and synthesizable vaccine, and we can bring all sorts of different pieces of messenger RNA against all sorts of different variants together, make double ones, triple, quadrivalent vaccines. And it's a platform that can adapt quickly and can then be scaled up.
And you said that we're awaiting the sort of newest data, and you've said that will hopefully be available over the next few days. So realistically, and looking at the kind of current regulatory regime, how long between getting that data and or how long would it be between getting that data and actually having a vaccine approved that could be specific to the Omicron variant?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the data that I think we'll get in the coming days will say how good is our mRNA 1273 vaccine against the current originator strain of COVID. How well does that deal with Omicron? And we've seen pieces of data come out around the world looking at other vaccines, so we'll be able to be part of that puzzle and fill that in a little bit more. We announced late in November, as soon as the world really became aware of Omicron, that we were going to begin working at risk to develop a specific booster against Omicron. And again, my colleagues in research and development and manufacturing have been doing that tirelessly over the last few weeks. We should be ready within some coming weeks. We're making the messenger RNA, we're combining it to then begin testing it in humans to see, does it make an antibody response? How well do those antibodies then bind to Omicron and neutralize it? I think realistically that's going to take until early in 2022, and then we would begin to manufacture. I would say, again, listening to earlier comments, that the Vaccine Task Force, JCVI, MHRA in the United Kingdom have been remarkable to work with. And, again, they've been very fast to review data. And I would imagine that they and other regulators around the world will be, be in a similar position.
And final question from me. If we find that this variant-specific vaccine really is necessary to give the maximum possible protection, do you think it will be approved, manufactured, distributed, and in people's arms in time to have a substantial impact on the Omicron wave, or do you think that process is a little bit too long?
I think it depends how long this goes on for. If it's, it's doubling very fast. We've seen now cases just rising throughout the world. The best thing we can do, I think, right now is to do the simple measures of hand sanitization, mask wearing, some social distancing, get vaccinated and get boosted either with the 50 microgram or the 100 microgram dose. I think, if Omicron continues to be surging in March and April, it may be possible that we could have small amounts of available vaccine that's specific by then, but otherwise it may need to be later in the first half of the year.
Thank you, Dana. Just to follow up Dana's last question, since it will take a bit of time for a specific vaccine to be developed, you're speaking from the United States. Are measures being taken in the United States now to impose new social distancing restrictions because of Omicron?
I think, people are being advised by physicians, by local state regulators to take appropriate precautions. And I would say, whereas as we went through the summer, and I think globally everybody felt that there was some light at the end of the tunnel, and those were being relaxed, I would say here now, many people are walking around with masks on again on the street, at least around here.
What do you think are the appropriate responses before a new vaccine is available? What would you advise your friends and colleagues to do?
Look, Delta is a severe disease, and it's even before we had heard of Omicron, it was surging and it was causing high rates of hospitalization, which are straining, already overstretched health systems. And as we go into the winter, that's getting worse. Omicron is spreading very fast, and as I said, I think it is an important and serious virus. So I think frequent hand washing, simple things like frequent hand washing, wearing a mask, keeping social distancing as appropriate, that's very effective. And those are simple things that we can do and will protect people.
You may have heard
getting vaccinated and getting boosted really is the way forward. While the levels of antibody or their effectiveness against Omicron will be lower, we've seen that, they will still afford protection and they will still protect people.
You may or may not have seen that there are some important votes in the UK Parliament today on some measures taken in response to Omicron. They include extending the requirement to wear masks in certain places, to isolate subject to testing. But one is about having certification to enter venues where there are large crowds. In your experience and your judgment, is that an appropriate response at this stage of knowledge about Omicron?
I think it's difficult to comment on. I haven't really seen that situation, and I just don't think really I'm qualified to give an opinion on it.
I understand. That's fine. Graham Stringer.
Dr. Burton, did you hear the evidence given by Dr. Angelique Kutsia earlier on? Were you online then?
No, I was not.
Oh, right. It rather wrecks my question, that, because but I will still ask it in a different way. You have given a much more pessimistic view of the interpretation of the statistics on Omicron than Dr. Kutsia did. You used Danish statistics, she used her experience in South Africa and South African statistics. Does that mean it's too soon to tell, or something differently might be happening in Denmark and South Africa?
Well, first of all, look, I have great respect for her and for the healthcare professionals in South Africa. You know, they're on the ground right now, trying to tackle this disease, and they're seeing patients coming in. Look, it's summer in South Africa. The demographics of people in South Africa are different. The fact, though, that the virus can reinfect and has taken off. If you think back to early November, there were maybe 250 cases a day in South Africa, and now there can frequently be 20,000 cases a day, so it's spreading. And I think those rates of, intensive care bed use within hospitalized people in South Africa are worrisome to me. But I think now, as the virus moves here to the Northern Hemisphere, to winter, to situations where, as I say, there are 50, 60, 70,000 cases a day in some European countries, including the UK, of Delta, to bring Omicron onto that backbone, that background of COVID is concerning. But I have full respect for her actually being in there fighting this disease today.
Thank you. You explained very clearly why your company has opted for RNA-based viruses, and that gives you speed and flexibility as to the adenoviruses that Oxford and AstraZeneca have developed. Is it fair to say, from the statistics that we've got, that more traditional viruses that use dead virus or very dilute virus in the long term are more effective than either adenoviruses or messenger RNA-based viruses?
I don't think I can really answer that. I think it will probably depend on which disease manufacturers want to try and tackle, how complex are the antigens that they need to tackle. I would just say, again, that the vaccines we have from a whole variety of manufacturers today are all very effective. Clearly I represent Moderna, and I think that the vaccine that we produce is very safe and very effective. But if people are able to get any vaccine today, they should make that choice and get it, and they should get boosted.
Can you give any insight into the difference between the different platforms and the effectiveness? I take the point, you get what vaccine is available and it will give you some protection, but do you have any insight into the differences of effectiveness between the different platforms?
Look, I don't think I can really comment on it. The one thing I would say is that when you think back to the start of this pandemic, the world was happy. We used to talk about a vaccine that would have 50% effectiveness would be quite gratefully received. And all of them, whichever platform, have substantially greater effectiveness than that. So I think they're all very good. And, you know, over time, as I say, I think different platforms will be tailored to different diseases.
Thank you. You were reported to be developing specific vaccines that were specific against the Beta and Delta variants. What happened to them?
Yes, so we do have one which is in development. It's been tested in humans, and those data should be available. Again, my research and development colleagues are running those studies and developing that vaccine. It's called 213, mRNA 1273.213. So those data should be available later this year, and we'll have some data then.
Is that against Delta? Or?
It's against Beta and Delta together, and the other one, which is .211, is against the original strain and Beta.
Right, that's
and in addition, at risk, we're making the one against Omicron.
And some time ago, this predecessor committee of this committee had an investigation into flu vaccines, and the experts we had in then said that they hoped and were working on the possibility of a universal flu vaccine within 10 years or so. Do you think there's any possibility of the development of a universal vaccine against COVID?
I do. I think the technology exists. I think as time goes on and we understand the mutations that this virus goes through, which are the most important for public health, we will be able to engineer such a vaccine. You know, for now, we have to just keep reacting to it and moving as fast as we can, working with regulators and health professionals around the world and governments, which is clearly what we're doing now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Burton, for joining us. It's very useful to have your perspective, both as a chief medical officer of a company, but also representing one of the principal vaccines. We've heard during our inquiries from your equivalents in AstraZeneca and Pfizer as well, so it's very helpful to hear from you. Particularly grateful for you joining us early in the morning in the United States, and we'll leave you to go for breakfast now.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Whilst we invite our final panel of witnesses, and I'm pleased to welcome Professor Stephen Riley, who is the Director General for Data, Analytics and Surveillance at the UK Health Security Agency, and Dr. Susan Hopkins, who is the Chief Medical Advisor at the UK Health Security Agency. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Obviously, there is an important set of votes in the House of Commons later today. I think perhaps one of the more contentious votes is this question of the certification that will be is required to access larger venues. Perhaps I could just start with Dr. Hopkins and ask what is the purpose, what's the intention of that requirement?
So the government are making a decision today on certification. Certification has been looked at long and hard for many months. Clearly, if you are vaccinated prior to Omicron, there was evidence that vaccination with 2 doses prevented symptomatic and asymptomatic infection. And if you like, vaccination prevents things at different levels at different space. So it's best at preventing severe disease. It's next best at preventing milder disease that we see in the community. And underneath that, it has a less effectiveness preventing asymptomatic disease, but does nonetheless, prior to Omicron, do that. With Omicron, what we're seeing is that from the vaccine effectiveness results that we released last Friday is very minimal protection after 3 months post-vaccine in preventing symptomatic disease, and therefore we would expect to find absolutely minimal protection against asymptomatic disease in that group. However, we would still expect the vaccines to prevent severe disease, and therefore if you are vaccinated going into a venue like this, especially if you've less than 12 weeks or you've had your booster, then that's good to prevent infection and transmission. But nonetheless, for all of those individuals, it will reduce the risk of severe disease. Government are making a decision today about whether that also includes lateral flow devices. Lateral flow devices will detect asymptomatic as well as symptomatic infection, and they've been used very effectively now for almost 1 year in the UK population. What we know is that overall it will detect about 50% of cases compared to PCR, but it will detect about 80% or even more than that of people who have high amounts of virus and therefore at the highest risk of transmitting to others. And therefore adding in lateral flow devices to this, and while the certification will talk about vaccine or lateral flows, our strong public health recommendation is if people are going out to venues to socialise, they should do a lateral flow before they go to reduce the risk of going into that venue with asymptomatic infection and therefore transmitting to others. So I think there's parts on both sides. I think it will be strengthened when more people have had their booster, as will happen over the next couple of weeks, because that will strengthen the immune response to Omicron.
At the moment, Dr. Hopkins, as you say, to use your words, there's minimal protection from infection from the 2 doses that may increase with a booster. So it's not that there's any security that a venue is safe that comes from knowing that people have had 2 doses of a vaccine. Is part of the intention of asking for proof of vaccination to, as it were, sort of nudge more people to have the vaccines?
So firstly, up to 12 weeks after your Pfizer dose, after you've had 2 doses of Pfizer, you look like you have a pretty excellent response. It's just that the immune waning after that happens. So for many young people, they will be within their 12 weeks of their second dose. So the results that we released last week show that group actually had quite a good reduction in symptomatic disease post-vaccine. It wanes after 12 weeks, and that's why the vaccinations have been brought forward to 3 months. So I would say that the fact here is that we would recommend that people take lateral flows before they go, and we recommend that people get their booster as fast as they can.
Is it part of the plan or the aspiration that making it a requirement to have one or other of these certificates will encourage some of the 10% of people who haven't been vaccinated to have the vaccine in order to be able to access a football ground, say?
So the current certification is allowing people to have lateral flows. So I don't think it's going to necessarily get over those individuals who do want vaccine. My belief from a clinician and a public health point of view is that we constantly have to talk about the science of vaccination and show what those vaccines do in order to overcome individuals who are vaccine hesitant or cautious due to side effects. That's why we release data every week.
Right. So it's not, you're not expecting that will have a big change in the kind of final 10%, this requirement. That requires other methods.
That requires, I think, us explaining the science and being very clear on the benefits of vaccines.
I see. So turning to the other kind of limb of the new policy, which is the ability to show a negative lateral flow test for entry. If that were universal, if everyone had to show a negative lateral flow test, then that would at least provide some security that was a safe venue for COVID transmission, would it not?
So again, the public health advice is to take a lateral flow before you go out to socialise at the moment. We would recommend that. The government certification policy, which has been discussed for many months, includes certification or a lateral flow test, but it does not preclude people doing a lateral flow test in addition to being vaccinated.
So my question is, why are the two combined? If everyone took a lateral flow test, then you could that would convey a degree of security about the prospects of infection in a venue. But if some people have taken a lateral flow test and some people have proof of 2 doses of the vaccine, as you said earlier, if you've had that some time ago, then actually you'll have quite a limited protection against transmission, including to other people. So you've got a mix there of 2 different things and therefore different policies. Does it make sense to have these as alternatives?
So again, I come back to the vaccination and being vaccinated. If you're within 12 weeks, that will be much more effective than beyond 12 weeks. And many young people who will be going to these venues will have more recent vaccination. Everyone can now get a booster at 12 weeks, and we recommend that people come forward for those as soon as possible. And finally, having a vaccination reduces your risk of severe disease. So again, promoting this idea that all of these are important measures, and everyone can do a lateral flow test before they go. It's just people who are not vaccinated won't be able to enter a venue without one or the other.
But isn't the logic of what you just said that people should be admitted if they've had 2 doses within 12 weeks, in which case their protection against transmission is still high, or a negative lateral flow test? Wouldn't that be the logical transposition of what you just said?
So I think that this will be for government to make a decision on.
But you're the government agency that advises the government on this. So what would your advice be?
So we have, apologies, I keep getting Skype called. We have continued to advise the government on the evidence for policy making. We have continued to advise on the importance of vaccination to prevent severe disease, the importance of boosters, and again, taking the advice of JCVI as the experts for vaccination. Those boosters are now at 3 months. And we've continued to advise on the utility of lateral flow tests.
Have you advised on the regulation that is before Parliament today, which requires either a negative lateral flow test or proof of 2 vaccines in order to access venues? Have you advised on that regulation?
So we have advised that the optimal is being vaccinated, and that we also recommend that people have lateral flows before they go.
But specifically on the regulation, is your advice that this is the right regulation to put forward?
So we have not been asked to do we agree with the regulation as proposed. That's for government to do. So
who drafted the regulations?
I don't know.
Whose idea were they?
As far as I understand, the regulations are drafted by government.
They're literally drafted,
public health advice.
Conceptually, who had the idea of giving an alternative of proof of vaccine or proof of a negative lateral flow test? If it didn't come from the UK Health Security Agency, where did it come from?
I'm afraid, we've continued to advise government that we recommend that people take lateral flows before they go out. That is the current public health advice, is that people should use lateral flows before they socialise. We continue to advise that people get vaccinated.
I understand
and that we optimise the vaccination uptake.
I do understand that, but we have a debate and a vote at the end of it, and I think many members of Parliament will be looking to the UK Health Security Agency, which is there to give that expert assessment of what's in front of them. What, if you haven't caused the regulation to be put before Parliament, have you been, as an agency, consulted on the regulation as to whether you think this does the job?
So we continue to recommend, as I've said, that everyone should take a lateral flow before they go.
I understand that, but on the regulation itself, have you been consulted on whether this regulation is fit for purpose?
No, not personally.
Well, you're here as a representative, as the Chief Medical Officer of the UK Health Security Agency. Has the agency?
So we have continued to recommend that the strongest public health intervention is vaccination.
No, I do understand that, and you've been absolutely clear about that, and you've been crystal clear on it. But on the regulation that's before Parliament today, has the UK Health Security Agency advised on it?
So we have continued to give our consistent advice that we believe that people should have lateral flow tests before they go into a venue, and that they should be vaccinated.
We understand that, but you said that you personally haven't advised on it. Well, you're the chief medical advisor of the agency. It would be odd, would it not, if someone other than you, or you weren't involved in a conversation as literally the head medical advisor of the agency?
So I think, again, I reiterate that we've continued to advise that having both is the strongest, having one or the other is the next strongest, and having neither is very weak.
I understand that, but I also understand that you said that you haven't advised on the specific regulation. My colleague, and then Erin Bell.
Why it's different and why we should be worried from your perspective, Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you. So Omicron is a new variant that was first identified in samples from genome sequencing and uploaded onto GISAID, which is the global sequencing database, on the 22nd of November. It has more than 50 mutations compared to the original variant that emerged from Wuhan in January 2020. The mutations were predicted to make the virus more transmissible, bind more tightly to the receptors that allow it to bind at the back of our throats, and also to evade the immune system to some extent. We have been studying this virus for 3 weeks today, and in that time period, we have shown that in the UK that this is growing very fast, with a growth rate of initially 2 to 3 days, and that growth rate seems to be shortening rather than lengthening at the moment. We've also shown that the virus in the laboratory does not neutralize, is not effectively neutralized by people who've had vaccine or have had prior infection compared to other variants. And we released vaccine data on Friday evening to show that after 12 weeks after your initial vaccine and before you've had a booster, your risk of acquiring this infection, at least mild disease in community, is very, very low, much, much lower than we've ever seen before. We currently have 10 individuals who are admitted to hospital with the diagnosis of Omicron before or on the day of admission. We're watching those numbers very, very carefully, and we do not have enough individuals in hospital in this country to be able to give an understanding of severity. We would hope that the vaccine high uptake that we have will make the severity of this less than we've seen in previous waves that we've had. But we are concerned with the large volume of individuals who are being infected every day in the population, that we are going to have a very difficult 4 weeks ahead with cases in the community, which will of course cause individuals to need to stay off work and school, and then for those cases to transfer into admissions to hospital.
There's a lot in there. I hope we have the opportunity to unpack it. But thank you. I'm gonna start with the ability to get it again. So you're suggesting that these 50-odd mutations, the tightness of the binding, means that even if you had it before, you're likely to get Omicron again. What's the likelihood of you becoming severely ill on this reinfection? So we can see the case rate spiking. What the people are worried about is their likelihood of severe disease, or giving somebody vulnerable that level of severe disease. Dr. Hopkins, if I start with you, and then Professor Riley, I might dive into some numbers on that, if that's all right. Dr. Hopkins.
Yeah, so first of all, again, less than 3 weeks from when we've identified the first case, we are seeing reinfections, and a higher rate of reinfections in Omicron compared to Delta, with a rate of 3 to 8 times the reinfection risk for Omicron compared to what we'd seen with Delta. What we don't yet have is a signal of severity, but we would expect people who are reinfected to be similar to people who've had a vaccination. And we know that the vaccine effectiveness for Omicron for severe disease, we will have to wait until we have cases in hospital to make that assessment. But in making it for Delta, we had seen that the vaccine effectiveness against severe disease was above 80%, and actually, when you had been boosted, was above 90% for all individuals. That means that essentially, if you'd had 10 individuals who would have come into hospital before you had been vaccinated, only one individual would come into hospital now. So that makes a significant difference to the population in getting severe disease. The issues, of course, are that we have very high rates of infection in the population already with Delta. We have currently got, on average, across the UK, between 700 and 1,000 people coming into hospital every day. And so increases there will put the healthcare system under pressure.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So, Professor Rowley, welcome. Thank you so much for your time today. I guess what I'm the key to this, as Dr. Hopkins and other experts have talked about, is the volume of people coming into hospital with this new variant that require medical intervention. And if you've kind of, tripped and are a clumsy bugger like me, and you've tripped and fall over and you smack your head on the pavement, you're not being able to get the treatment that you need in that environment. And I think part of encouraging people to take the threat seriously is to allow them to understand their individual risk. So, we have, if you're over 80, your risk of severe disease, even if triple jabbed, is very different to if you're over 18 and triple jabbed. When you add over 80 risk, over 70 risk, over 60 risk, I'm going to do some numbers, over 40 risk, under 40 risk. When you add all of that together, plus the people that have chosen to not take a vaccine, can you give me an idea of the scale of the pool that could potentially, with a very rapid spreading wave, end up in hospital in the next 4 to 6 weeks?
Thank you very much for the invite.
You don't mean that, do you?
I mean, thank you for the invite and for the opportunity to try and explain some of the findings that we're all working together on at UKHSA. To try and assess the risk posed by this new variant and help government form policy that will mitigate and reduce that risk. So genuinely, thank you for the opportunity. I think you phrased the key question in a very efficient and specific way. And I think, unfortunately, for this variant, we cannot yet make an accurate calculation of that. So,
I'm sure there's a range in it, but I think the British public wants to know whether it's everybody, if it's 1 million people. Just help us out without impugning your scientific integrity.
It's not about scientific integrity. It's about making sure that we give the most useful numbers when we can. So the key question is, for the UK population and across all the different age groups, if with their different vaccination status, when and if they get infected with the Omicron variant, what's a reasonable proportion of those infections that will go on to need hospital treatment? Yeah. That is the number that we all want to know. And it's very, very difficult to estimate. You've heard there were numbers mentioned during this hearing this morning that are being reported today that we've not had chance to drill into yet. So earlier on today, a 29% reduction was mentioned from people in the risk of people attending hospital in South Africa with Omicron compared to Delta. I don't have any additional details on that, and that sounds like perhaps one of the most useful early numbers to come out. So with the greatest of respect and apologies, I cannot give you an estimate for that pool of susceptibles, other than to say there's a very real risk that is large, that a substantial proportion of the people in those age groups could possibly require medical hospital treatment if they're infected.
Thank you, Professor. So, given that pool of uncertainty, can we make assumptions, or have you made assumptions to try and just say, well, if it's 25% less effective than our models for Delta, what does that reduce? I mean, how are you trying to feel out the edges of the trajectories of this Omicron wave in the pandemic?
So, working together with colleagues in academia and with groups within the UK government, we're doing two parts to the risk assessment. The first is to try and characterize the speed of growth, to see just how fast the epidemic is progressing and to get a sense for how quickly the number of infections is going to increase. And then beyond that, we are thinking about a number of scenarios, and as I say, working with partners to see what the likely impact of that is on hospitalizations. So I probably would call out some very helpful work by colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that's gone specifically through a very reasonable set of assumptions covering a broad range and has outlined, a very useful set of scenarios that show the potential for the number of hospitalizations to approach and surpass levels of hospitalizations, high peaks of hospitalizations that have been observed in the past 2 years.
And the summary of that, I'm desperate to try and make this session accessible to non-turbo nerds. So the summary of that is, if it spreads really quickly and a lot of people get it really quickly and it's kind of similarly-ish virulent to Delta, then you're pouring a pint into a half-pint pot. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a very large number of infections doesn't need a very large proportion of those to go to hospital to be a problem. That's as has been expressed by the Prime Minister and others, really effectively in the last few days. If you get very many infections, it only needs to be a small proportion that go to hospital in order for there to be really high demand on healthcare services.
So, Dr. Hopkins, is there anything you would add to my kind of grilling of the numbers of Professor Riley?
I think what Professor Riley said is absolutely right. We will only know the number of people, the proportion who require hospitalisation when we have that number available to us. But if we have 1 million infections a day, even a very small proportion of those individuals requiring hospitalisation will put a significant impact on healthcare.
Just one final question for me, Chair, if that's all right. Given, I mean, it's a frightening number to come out with, but given that 1 million infections a day is something that you're considering, we potentially are at 250,000 already. To what extent is that going to just flash and burn through the population very quickly? I've heard colleagues point out that there aren't 400 million people in the UK when they do that doubling time. So where is the timing and the rate limiting step on this flash transmission because no one's got an exponential growth because no one's got any immunity? I don't know who to ask that to.
Should I jump in on
that
one?
Yeah, go on.
So you're absolutely right. As if the exponential growth continues for very much longer, then we'll expect other processes to come into play, and we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be a very rapid epidemic. If we look back through the earlier waves, what we observed in the data, and then in the kind of behaviour data, in the movement data, and then later on reflected in the disease data, is that people adapt their behaviour and the rate slows down. So when prevalence gets very high, the evidence from the UK and around the world is that people tend to change their behaviour and naturally reduce infection. So it's very difficult to say how fast a peak would be, but we'll certainly be watching very closely in countries that have been affected earlier than we have, for example, South Africa.
So at a very basic level, if we run at 1 million a day, there's only 70 million people on our small islands. It cannot go on longer than 70 days, which is just over 2 months.
So I would expect at the very least there will be good short-term immunity. So you're right, very high levels of infection are time limited, but the speed with which we actually peak out is looking back through patterns observed elsewhere in the world isn't always as fast as some of the theoretical studies suggest.
Right. Okay. So it's get a jab and try and flatten the sombrero with your personal behaviours in the intervening period.
That's definitely one way of putting it.
Fair enough. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just before I go to Erin Bell, on the subject of statistics, Professor Riley, you've obviously got a very important job as the Director General for Data and Analytics. And people are looking to you, the public is looking to you to have a way to understand what's going on. Hospitalisation is clearly very important, and Dr. Hopkins has mentioned that because it has implications for whether the NHS can cope. But it's not just the question of whether someone goes into hospital that is relevant, it's how long someone stays in hospital, is it not? And what is the evidence so far of the length of time that people with Omicron, whether in this country or overseas, are staying in hospital?
You're absolutely right. That is a key. It's a key quantity to estimate because it links those admissions to the overall volume of people in the NHS, which is the constrained resource that we are most concerned with. At the moment for the UK, given we have very, very few confirmed in hospital right now, I am not aware of any estimates of duration in stay from the UK data. I believe there are some initial reports. In fact, your earlier witness today, I believe, may have mentioned some observations from South Africa that the length of stay may be shorter there compared to prior waves. I would also comment that hospital stay is actually also dependent on the healthcare system. There are different protocols, different traditions, and slightly different approaches to treatment. So it's one of those variables that's not very straightforward to map across from one healthcare system to another. So on that one, I think we will have to develop our estimates as rapidly as we can from data from the UK.
Well, they do need to be rapid because some important decisions rest on these, and you have a responsibility in public office responsible for the accuracy of data in terms of people's ability to understand it. To reflect this is a very important calculation, isn't it? If people are spending 5 days in hospital rather than 4 weeks in hospital, that has huge implications for what consequences we may need to take to protect the NHS. When are you going to publish your estimates of this, given that you're already in the public domain models of hospitalisation?
You're absolutely right. It's a very important quantity. We will work with partners across government and external academics and in order to help provide those estimates. I cannot give you a timeline for publishing an accurate version of that number today.
Your role, as we've been talking about with Dr. Hopkins, is to advise the government and with transparency advise Parliament and the public on what is the rationale for measures. You lead the data profession within the UK Health Security Agency. Do you recognise your personal responsibility to make sure these data are out there? However, in some cases, inconvenient it might be for a case that the government or others might be willing to make, even if it undermines it.
Yes, I recognise my personal responsibility.
Thank you very much. Aaron Bell.
Thank you. If I could stay with you, Professor Riley. You just mentioned the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine model. Under their most likely scenario, and I accept that we need to look at worst case scenarios as well, they outlined a peak of 6,000 hospital admissions in the new year compared to 4,000 last year and potentially 40 to 50,000 deaths by the end of April. But that was assuming a similar case fatality rate to Delta, which does look now that that's not a correct assumption. Is that fair?
I would probably need you to clarify the most likely scenario because I thought they were fairly even-handed across a number of different scenarios. But I do recognise the numbers that you're giving, and yes, the underlying severity in these models, as in some kind of baseline intrinsic severity for the new strain, is assumed to be similar to Delta. So yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
And the 29% that you referenced that I mentioned to Dr. Kutsia earlier, that was mildness compared to the original strain. And I think you may have misquoted that, and obviously it's new data to you. How much more severe than the original strain is Delta? So therefore, how much, if that 29% is to be believed, how much less severe is Omicron relative to Delta?
There are some good studies. There's a number of different estimates on the relative severity across the variants, and I apologise, I do not have that to hand. So we can seek to find a summary of that and provide it afterwards. But my understanding is there are estimates of slight increases in severity across those prior variants.
Yes.
So it would perhaps be a slightly larger decrease if that were the case. But I'm a little bit, given the chair's prior comments about my professional responsibilities. I'm a little hesitant to speculate too much here.
That's fair enough. I was Googling to try and find that number, and I couldn't find it easily as well. To go to the same questions, the same topic that Catherine went on about the sort of size of the peak and the fact that exponential growth will eventually have to become logistic because you've only got so many people to infect. What's your current estimate for a peak number of cases? It'll obviously be broad, but what sort of peak are you expecting? 200,000 official cases a day. Case numbers, the official case numbers, not the background infection level.
That's right. So you raise a very important point that there is a massive difference between the number of infections which might occur on any given day, which we try and get at through studies such as the ONS infection survey or the REACT survey, versus the number of cases that are actually reported, because people have to actually be able to go and get a test and have it reported. So I think for the levels of infection that are being looked at here, the actual peak number of cases will probably revolve around peak testing capacity, which is not something that I can speculate on right now. Okay. If I could, I think I'll turn to Dr. Hopkins now. Following on from what we were discussing with Dr. Burton of Moderna, do you think that Omicron is going to displace Delta, or do you think they're going to end up coexisting? Is that in your professional judgment?
So again, I think the earliest signal that we can have from this is what's happening in London right now, where we are now seeing that the report we released yesterday shows that just over 44% of all cases in London are Omicron. In those that have been tested for the S gene, and is a good representative sample of what's happening in London. We are seeing increases in the total number of cases in London. So London has doubled its cases over the last 4 weeks. But what we are seeing is that we expect to see Omicron displace Delta, but they are going to live together in parts of the country for longer. And we are going to continue to see hospitalizations from Delta for the next 2 weeks, baked in from the numbers that we have. And then we will start seeing the Omicron case numbers come into hospital.
Are we expecting Omicron, are we expecting exposure to Omicron to give people protection against Delta? Is that baked into our modelling, or do we not know yet?
Well, so what we know is that if you've had a prior infection, up till this point, reinfection was extremely rare, and the Siren study, which I lead, has shown that very effectively as well. And reinfection with vaccination is even better. If you've had infection and vaccination, then your protection is much, much higher. What I think we would say is that we can see that in South Africa, they have reported that individuals who are infected in their Delta wave were more likely to get infected with Omicron. And we are seeing a higher rate of reinfection than we've seen before. Therefore, there will be protection, I think, from severe disease if you've had one variant or the other. But these new variants may not protect you from mild disease and may not protect you from transmitting to others.
Practical implications of this Omicron surge. We've already seen that lateral flow tests are flying off the shelves and people haven't been able to get them delivered because the booking slots have already gone. I mean, there's something of a fuel crisis about that perhaps. But secondly, PCR tests, we only have a capacity of maybe about 600,000 tests a day. Are we going to have to stop recommending that contacts of people get a PCR test? Because it seems to me that we're just not going to have the capacity to deal with the numbers that Omicron implies over the next fortnight or so.
So the recommendation that's going for contact testing, which is where people will do 7 lateral flow tests, currently we would be recommending that takes the priority over PCR tests if we run short on PCR capacity. But we would want to maintain PCR capacity for people with symptomatic disease, those being admitted to hospital, those in care homes that get tests regularly from staff and from residents, and in situations where we were investigating an outbreak or cluster in a high-risk environment.
And are we confident about the quantity of lateral flow tests that we have on hand?
So the testing team have assured me that we have plenty of lateral flow tests in warehouses, plenty more on order to service the demand from the population over the coming weeks.
And finally, I mean, one way or another, given the transmissibility, I think this is we're going to know where we are in 6 to 8 weeks, as for the reasons that Catherine discussed in her questions. Does that mean that the measures that we've announced and are being debated are probably going to get eased one way or the other? The real question over the next 8 weeks is just how much impact it has on the NHS. And at the end of 6 to 8 weeks, then pretty much most people will have been exposed to Omicron and either caught it or not caught it, depending on their previous immunity. Is that a reasonable assessment of what's going to happen over the next 6 to 8 weeks, Dr. Hopkins? And I'll come to Professor Riley afterwards.
Yeah, so again, it comes back to the point about how much we slow the transmission and spread by the changes in behaviour over the coming weeks, how we reduce our social contacts and therefore reduce transmission. So that wave that's coming very fast may slow down with all of those measures. And that's good because that slows down the doubling time for any admissions that we may see in hospital, because the ratio of hospitalizations to cases will at some point, we will know better. So ideally, the wave goes a bit slower than rapid increases over the next 2 to 3 weeks, which could cause major challenges with those rapid increases in cases in the NHS. However, I think that if the measures work, if cases slow, if hospitalizations if the NHS is able to cope with the hospitalizations, then there is a point in the future, very difficult to predict the time, where we will return to how we were before the start of December.
Okay, and Professor Riley, last point.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with Professor Hopkins' comments and just make a general point that throughout the last 2 years, epidemics caused by the virus have been much slower than we would have expected at the beginning. So I would emphasize that if this does place high demand on healthcare services, then I think we are likely to see more substantial changes in behavior and therefore a considerably slower wave, but it's very difficult to quantify and predict that in advance.
Have you made any estimates of the effect on the R rate of both what we're doing today and secondly the behavioural changes that will happen regardless of what the government does?
The behavioural changes that are being made today, we've not made any precise estimates of those. I believe that they are available, so I will try and get back to you with some estimates of those. And then the behaviour changes is very difficult to predict, but we'll be keeping an eye closely on proxies for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Dawn Butler, then Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions. Thank you both for coming in. On the 3rd of December, you said that none of the Omicron patients were known to have been hospitalised or have died, and the European Centre for Disease Control and Prevention also drew the same conclusion to that. That was at the 3rd of December. I'm just wondering, is that still the case?
So as we released data yesterday, we have 10 patients who have been hospitalised with the diagnosis prior to or on the day of admission with Omicron. One individual who was diagnosed in hospital within their hospital stay with Omicron has sadly died. So that is updated information that we released yesterday.
Thank you. And did the person who has sadly died, do they have underlying conditions?
So as you know, we try not to release any data about individuals for their confidentiality reasons.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you very much. And just to pick up on some of the questions earlier, just for clarity for me as a non-scientist, are you basing any modelling on what's happening in South Africa?
So perhaps I'll go ask Stephen to lead on that for the modelling question.
Yeah, so the main work that we're doing at the moment is to measure the speed of growth and then just to extend that, to project forward a little bit, to try and get a good understanding of what's happening right now. So in terms of measuring the growth that we see here in the UK, we have also looked at speeds of growth elsewhere in the world, and we've seen similar speed of growth in South Africa. They had a very, very rapid increase in cases in the period just when we were starting to work on the virus. And there are also examples around the world, and I think Denmark are also reporting very rapid rates of growth. So not so much in actually making a model, but in the key kind of characteristics that we're trying to study, we're seeing similar patterns elsewhere in the world.
Thanks. I mean, the growth in South Africa, is that not because they've only got 23% of people vaccinated as a population?
Well, I think we even though we have much higher levels of vaccination here, we're seeing very similar growth rates. So the immune state of the two populations are definitely different, and that will be having an impact. But we haven't seen something substantially slower here yet because of our vaccination.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Hopkins, just lastly, on some of the questions the chair was asking, is it correct to say that the Prime Minister is implementing new legislation today that he hasn't consulted UK HSA about? Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, so I think we have been consulted. We've given our advice. The decisions on what goes into regulations are decisions that are made across a number of government departments with a number of different advice that goes in. We are one part of that. We have consistently given advice that we recommend lateral flows before people go into venues. That is the current public health advice that is there now that we highlighted last week. And we consistently give advice that vaccination will prevent against severe disease, but currently 2 doses of vaccination more than 3 months ago will not prevent transmission or people acquiring this infection based on the results that we released at the end of last week. Yeah. So I think it's important to recognise that we are one part, that there are multiple other parts, and that government and the regulations take in all parts of our views whilst making those regulations.
Thank you. I mean, I understand that you consistently give advice. Did you give any specific advice from the announcement that was made on Sunday?
So again, the announcement on Sunday on vaccines or certification?
The Prime Minister,
trying to clarify.
The Prime Minister's statement to the country. I just wondered if anything triggered that from you.
The Prime Minister's statement to the country on Sunday evening related to vaccinations?
Yes, vaccinations and testing capacity, and which you say is consistent in the advice that you've been given. I just wondered, was there anything specific that would have triggered that announcement?
I don't know. No, not.
Don't worry. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Graham Stringer and then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Professor Riley, I understand what Dr. Hopkins said before about patient confidentiality, but overall one of the statistical irritations, to me at least, during this epidemic has been the statistic about dying within 28 days of a test. I can see that's statistically consistent, but it doesn't tell you how many people died of the prime cause being COVID. Do you have those figures?
So the official statistic that we use to track deaths directly caused from COVID is dying within 28 days of a positive test. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about that, especially last year, and that was arrived at as the recommended official statistic. Obviously, it's not the only thing that we track, and it's not the only thing that scientists and epidemiologists around the world track in relation to COVID deaths. Another key statistic is the excess mortality. So that's not specifically looking at people with a positive test for COVID. That's comparing patterns of deaths within countries, regardless of the cause of death, during a period of high circulation of the virus compared to the time series in the years before. And actually, when you do that, you do see some very substantial discrepancies around the world. In the UK, just to reassure members of the committee, we do have fairly good agreement between, not perfect, we have fairly good agreement in the patterns of excess mortality compared to the patterns of deaths within 28 days of a test. So I think certainly at the population level, we have good reason to have faith in that statistic that has been agreed upon.
The statistic, I mean, we had a whole session with Spiegelhalter on the statistics of excess deaths, and you come to a point where your excess deaths are negative, don't you, because people die earlier. So it's not the greatest statistic in the world. But the deaths within 28 days obscures things, doesn't it? Because you're partly measuring the infectivity, the infections caused in in hospitals. If you go into hospital, you're dying of cancer, you pick up an infection, high infection rates in hospital, you come out as part of that statistic, whereas one was always going to die of cancer. So I would think it was important to know, not just from a statistical base, which has all sorts of oddities about it, as I've just mentioned, how many people are dying and the prime cause is COVID. Why can't we get at that statistic?
In small studies where we can, and these are epidemiological studies, they do sometimes go in detail through case records and try and come to the type of judgment that you've just outlined. And that's really, and you need multiple people to review case notes and then to have a discussion and arrive at a somewhat subjective opinion about the precise cause of death for each of the individuals. So the concerns that you've just raised, they can be addressed, but that very much happens within a research setting. And again, just kind of to give an initial response, I can't envisage a process such that we could try and do that for every single potential death caused by the virus. So I think it's the short answer is that to actually get that for every single case, I suspect would be enormously resource intensive. And just even though I certainly accept Professor Spiegelhalter will have given very good comments on the use of all-cause mortality, excess mortality, I wasn't necessarily saying that was perfect. My main comment was that the statistic we have agreed to use in the UK does have very good mapping to it relative to decisions that have been taken in other countries, perhaps. So it was more to reassure that it is a pretty good measure. But you're right, on individual cases and in small studies, it may be possible to get at more detail.
Dr. Atkins, this time last week, almost exactly this time last week, the Deputy Prime Minister was telling us that there was no need to implement Plan B. Did you give any advice to say he was talking nonsense, that things were going to change very quickly, or that he was right? Did you give any advice immediately after that statement? Because the government's actions changed dramatically within 36 hours.
So I think we review the data with government ministers as a part of our daily review of the Omicron data on a daily basis. And then government look and part of what we say and what other experts say across government to make decisions.
I understand the relationship between advice and government policy making, but did you give any specific advice that led to the change in policy over that 36-hour period?
No new specific advice, just a daily review of the advice, the measures that were available, which the government knew. They had Plan B already under discussion since the summer, and of course the regular review of the input from SAGE.
Right. A very different kind of question, if I may, Dr. Hopkins. It's something that's puzzled me throughout the epidemic. We got rid of our isolation hospitals, I don't know, perhaps 30 years ago. Do you think we would have done better in this epidemic? I know it's a hypothetical question, but it's an interesting one for the future planning of the health service. If we'd had isolation hospitals, because a lot of infection took place in hospitals.
So you're absolutely right. Some infection did take place in hospitals, and having special wards in hospitals is critical. I think what we've seen in this pandemic is that despite the NHS repeatedly doing tests on patients as they come into hospital, on admission, day 3, day 5, day 7, and regularly thereafter, individuals who come in negative on the first day can subsequently become positive because they were incubation disease on admission. I think that therefore the segregation of these individuals would not have been completely possible, and we would have, while you can segregate individuals who are in A&E and can get a diagnosis and are positive on that day, those individuals who are negative on that day and need treatment for their cancer, their kidney disease, their cardiovascular disease, and subsequently either develop symptoms or are test positive in hospitals, could not have been averted by having separate hospitals. We also know the complexity of care that we deliver in the NHS is much greater, often requiring very complex multidisciplinary teams. And as somebody who did work in Coppitzwood Infectious Diseases Hospital many years ago, their high security unit, the fact is that we rely on multidisciplinary experts that are in our hospitals to provide excellent care for our patients.
Do you expect the development of antivirals to help in the coming rather critical 2 months or so? There have been a number of antivirals under test. Do you think they will help, and have they been taken into account in your projections of the number of people in hospital and the length of stay in hospital?
So I think that we have yet to see large-scale rollout of antivirals. Molnupiravir will be in use very soon and start being used. We've got monoclonal antibodies. One of those monoclonal antibodies, Ronapreve. We are worried about the effectiveness of that. So that actually is taking away a drug that we've been using in the NHS for the last number of weeks and months to treat people who come into hospital who are antibody negative. So that is a challenge. So where we've got new antivirals, we also have some drugs that have been now in use that may be less effective. We will be watching and monitoring with our NHS colleagues the safety, the efficacy and the effectiveness of these drugs in reducing length of stay, in reducing ICU admissions, and sincerely hope that they will have an effect, but we will need to wait and monitor that.
Thank you. Professor Riley, there have been statistics put out, very useful statistics, about the number of lives saved by vaccines. But as far as I've seen, and you can tell me there have been other stats put out, it's only been lives saved by vaccines, not by other either pharmaceutical interventions or non-pharmaceutical interventions. Why have those statistics not been produced?
Let me think for a moment if you're any good.
I mean, let me not hide behind the question. I mean, it seems to me that from the government's point of view, vaccine rollout's been great, they've saved a lot of lives, 3 cheers, but some of the other interventions have not worked so well, so we don't get statistics on those areas.
So there are the 2 very different types of calculation. I think there is some work on the efficacy of non-pharmaceutical interventions, but that has to be done at a population by population level. So the reason that we're able to make more precise estimates of the effectiveness of the vaccine is because it applies at the level of an individual, and we can gather data at the level of an individual, and we have pretty good confidence in tracking those outcomes, and there's a very well worked out kind of set of methods for us to do those calculations, and within UKHSA and other colleagues. So the short answer is we can give really good answers to individual level interventions. In order to assess the impacts of non-pharmaceutical interventions, you have to look at a population by population level, which makes them much more difficult. And I might just call out mask wearing here, which has been notoriously difficult as an intervention to try and assess, even before this pandemic and then during it. And what has shifted the needle really is a couple of very well-designed community level studies of mask wearing to show that there was, observed drops in transmissions in some communities that did use increased mask wearing and compared to those that didn't. And then when you look at so I think that's the basic answer is it's much more difficult to assess community level interventions compared to individual level interventions.
And my final question, if I may, and it's back to the questions that the chair was asking about the statutory instruments before us today, and it's to both our witnesses. How do you work with other parts of government to ensure that the government has fully assessed the impact of these measures?
So we work with our colleagues in the Department of Health and with other government departments to ensure that the evidence that's being put into any of their impact assessments is up to date.
But there are no impact assessments with the SIs.
So for the statutory instruments...
On the SIs before us today, at the end of each of these statutory instruments, it says there is no impact analysis being done. So does that mean you've not done the work, or the work hasn't been provided?
So from my point of view, we input into any of the documents that are shared with us from government colleagues. And we have provided the evidence for the interventions to the best of our ability.
So have you assessed the impact with other parts of the public sector?
So in the Department of Health leads on the impact assessments for SIs, where they have asked for our input, we have assessed, given our input.
Well, I'm going to draw the conclusion, if you're not more explicit with the answer, that the government is withholding impacts that have been done. Would that be a fair assessment?
I am unaware of this.
I don't understand that.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know of. I don't know if there's information that is being made available or not on impact assessments.
Sorry, I thought. Well, you've made the information available to government.
So we have provided the evidence for the interventions.
Right.
That we are where we can.
Thank you, Graham. Just briefly going back to one of the questions that Graham asked Professor Riley in terms of the recording of deaths of COVID, as it were, rather than within 28 days of a COVID test. Was I interpreting your answer correctly, that although they're not published, that there is a data set that you have of deaths where COVID is the cause of death?
No. I'm sorry if I was unclear in my.
So that data set doesn't exist. It's not.
I would probably clarify just to make sure. I was referring to alternative methods that are sometimes used in research.
So the research studies that you
yeah, but I was not in any way referring to any specific data that I'm aware of.
That's very helpful and very clear. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. The World Health Organization said this week that whilst there's limited data available, there was a reduction in vaccine efficacy against infection and transmission based on preliminary evidence. And we also know that even with the Delta variant, vaccinated people could still transmit it, although their viral load dropped far quicker than unvaccinated people. So we can be perfectly clear then. Can you confirm that in a venue where everybody who's accessed has only provided a COVID certificate, can you confirm that there has been a decrease in the risk of transmission, or whether there's still a significant risk of transmission of both Delta variant and Omicron? Dr. Hopkins.
So as I've said, and as we released last Friday in our vaccine efficacy studies, our effectiveness studies for mild disease in the community, the vaccine effectiveness to reduce mild disease in the community, so symptomatic disease in the community, was high if you were vaccinated in the previous 12 weeks within Pfizer, and also after 24 weeks. Now, given that the large, that everyone in the population has been invited to come forward after 3 months, and a large number of young people are still within that 3 months of their second vaccination, we would expect that in the population effect of people going in, then there will be a level of protection that is there for people who arrive in with the vaccine. That level of protection will be increased if they use a lateral flow test.
So just to be clear then, in a venue where people haven't taken a lateral flow test, but they've just gone with a COVID certificate, is there still going to be transmission of COVID, either Delta or Omicron variant? I don't think that was made clear in your answer, Dr. Hopkins. I understand that the impact of the severity of disease might be reduced in vaccinated people, but ultimately we're not clear on whether having the vaccination reduces the transmissibility of the Omicron and Delta variant.
So what we know is the vaccine effectiveness for mild disease for Delta is much higher than it is for mild disease for Omicron. but that it's the mild disease or the asymptomatic disease that causes people to transmit to others. The vaccine doesn't stop transmission, it stops people having infection that they can transmit. And so if the current vaccine effectiveness that was released last Friday, which showed that it within 12 weeks or after your boost, you had above a 70% reduction in mild disease, then there will be a protection against mild disease in that situation if you're vaccinated in that period of time. Therefore, that will help reduce transmission in the venue. And of course, the severity signal. I can't give you a percentage reduction because that depends on the population who's in that venue, the time since they're vaccinated, and the amount of disease in the population.
So in terms of access to that venue then, would you say it would be more likely to reduce transmission if everyone had taken a lateral flow test before entering the venue, or more likely to reduce transmission if everybody went in with a vaccine certificate? Because it's obviously an either-or option that we're being presented with on our regulations today within Parliament.
So I think we don't have studies that can tell you which one is the most effective. What we know is that the lateral flow devices remain as effective against Omicron as they did with Delta, that vaccine effectiveness is reduced, especially 3 months after your vaccine or before you've had your booster. I think that the recommendation from a public health point of view remains the same, but I think I won't be able to tell you which one is safer, one versus the other.
And what data and evidence do you have in relation to the transmissivity of Omicron specifically at the moment? Is that still very much an unknown situation, and are you basing a lot of your assumptions on the Delta transmissibility evidence that we have on vaccines?
So last Friday we showed that in household studies that there was a higher attack rate in individuals in households with Omicron compared to Delta. 2 to 3 odds of transmission in Omicron compared to Delta. Sometimes at the beginning of when you start seeing a wave, you see different types of people infected. So we need some time to make sure those data points are reliable and valid. We've also seen a higher secondary attack rate in Omicron compared to Delta. But again, because of case finding that often occurs at the start of a new wave, that may be slightly higher than what it will transpire to be. Nonetheless, because of the biological characteristics, we expect that there is a degree of increased transmission with Omicron over Delta.
Thank you. And then finally, what advice did you give to government on the mandatory vaccination of healthcare workers?
So again, the advice that we gave is that the healthcare workers are a high-risk population for transmission amongst themselves and to and from patients. Vaccinations protect them from severe disease, and they should be highly recommended to healthcare workers. Vaccination is an important factor in mitigation to prevent nosocomial transmission and nosocomial transmission within staff, and that mandation, it is unknown how much this will increase uptake amongst healthcare workers, or whether healthcare workers will stay or leave if they're asked to mandate. It is a challenged and nuanced moment. I think it's very important that every healthcare worker does take up the offer to get vaccinated, and that if they are working in frontline in vulnerable individuals, that vaccination is essential for them to have. Mandation decisions are with government.
Thank you, that's really helpful. So just to be clear, you didn't provide advice that advised for the mandation of vaccination for healthcare workers. It was rather that you highly recommended that healthcare workers should be vaccinated.
So the mandation is a decision for government. We provided advice on the why it's very important that healthcare workers get vaccinated and the ways to increase that uptake in healthcare workers.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Erin Bell had a follow-up question, I think.
Just on the number of vaccinated or unvaccinated people in hospital for COVID treatment, it might be one for Professor Riley. There have been some numbers in the press. What proportion of those in hospital for COVID are unvaccinated at the moment? You're on mute. There you're not.
Yes, I'm sorry. I do not have that number in my prep today. I apologise. That is a number that we track within the common kind of internal document.
I've seen in the press around sort of 80 to 90%. Is that a sort of level that you recognise? Either.
I would really have to go back and check, because that number does fluctuate during, as people, as the infection rises and falls, and with the dynamics of people being vaccinated themselves. So I would have to go and check. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. What I wanted to follow up and ask really was what proportion and what estimates have you made of the number of people who are actually refusing to have the vaccine, as opposed to obviously some people who can't have the vaccine? What is your estimate for the number of people who are refusing, for philosophical reasons, to have the vaccine in the United Kingdom, have had, let's say, no vaccines whatsoever? What's the estimate you're working with on that?
So I'll make a few comments, and I may ask Dr. Hopkins to come in as well, because I know that she's worked on this a lot. But over the course of the epidemic, we tracked through a variety of mechanisms. We asked people their propensity, what they feel about being vaccinated. In the very early days, there was some reluctance among especially younger age groups, and then as we progressed through the very successful vaccination program last year, that overall kind of intention to receive the vaccination, improved a lot, and the pool of people actively saying they were refusing was much reduced. So I don't think we consider it to be a permanent pool of people who are refusing. We focus on the positive, as Dr. Hopkins outlined so clearly earlier in our session. We try to focus on explaining the science and the benefits repeatedly in as clear a way as we can, so that as has happened throughout the pandemic, people continue to change their minds and take advantage of the vaccine.
Dr. Hopkins, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that number has been very variable over time, and there have been repeated studies looking at it. And actually the number who are vaccine hesitant has been reducing. And we expect to get to very high numbers as people are assured about the vaccine effectiveness and safety, and can see the changes it brings to them in their lives. It should be noted that we have very, very high vaccine uptakes, for example, for childhood illnesses and for vaccinations that we give out the groups, and have done for a very long time. And so we continually believe in reiterating the science around the vaccine, and to ensure that the benefits around the vaccine are well illustrated, and that we're also open and honest about any adverse events or side effects, so that people know that we will be there when and highlight a problem if there is one.
Sure, but is there an estimate of currently how many adults in the UK are refusing full stop? Because the implication, what we've heard, is that the pressure on the NHS is coming from unvaccinated people. The reason we're having to make restrictions and take measures is to avoid that pressure on the NHS. It's a very different scenario ethically to the one we faced in March 2020, where we're protecting everybody. If the reason, obviously we need to protect the NHS for everybody, but if the reason we're having to take measures is because of people who've refused to, we need to get a handle on that number and work out what measures we think are appropriate, through Parliament. Is there a number on what percentage of adults are basically point blank refusing?
That number is not recorded in details. People are repeatedly asked and invited for a vaccine, and anyone can walk in any time and take up the vaccine. And we are seeing people who decided they didn't want it a month ago change their mind.
Yes,
of course. I think that is a movable number.
But there must be a number. You know how many people have been vaccinated.
So we know that there are 5 million people who are eligible for vaccine who haven't started their vaccine course today, but each day that gets smaller and smaller. So it's not a number of people who are refusing it, it's a number of people who are hesitant, looking for information and changing their minds.
And is there a number for how many people simply can't have it because of their background conditions or anything?
So that's very small. The estimate for that number is less than 1 million. And again, that changes depending on it. We would still advise the vast majority of people who we think won't have very good immune responses to the vaccine to have it, because again, they may have sufficient responses that we can't detect very well in their blood to make their disease milder. So there's very, very small numbers of individuals who we would say should not have these vaccines. These vaccines are safe and effective. So it's mainly those who potentially have a drug allergy, or who are in the middle of severe treatment for other things, where any additional side effects would be difficult to understand.
So overall, that's around 4 million then that have not taken it up yet. Unlike you, I would encourage everyone to take it up, but within that, there are clearly some people who've decided they're not having it. And they may yet change their minds. I hope they change their minds, but that 4 million is roughly the number. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a final question for me. We've got these important votes in Parliament this afternoon on applying the Plan B measures. What is Dr. Hopkins, the exit route? Suppose we find that Omicron is more infectious and does lead to does lead to people being hospitalised. Are we going to have to live with these restrictions indefinitely, or what will cause them to come to an end?
Well, I think things that we know about are that there will be a wave of infections, as we've seen now. This is our 4th time going into something like this. The waves last a period of time. The more the restrictions are effective, then the smaller the peak, and therefore then you can reduce and return life to normal. I think having the population boosted and getting the population boosted will be an additional advantage to reducing hospitalizations. And of course, if this the boosting of vaccinations affects hospitalizations so that they're able to maintain full care for all individuals, and primary care is able to deliver what it needs to do at a rate that we've seen, so recognizing we've seen 700 to 1,000 admissions a day since July, so for 6 months, with very few restrictions on our ways of life, then I would hope that we would be able to return to that. But I think it is balancing between being able to deliver healthcare, being able to have sufficient amounts of delivery of all of that in order to get back to normal.
Based on the modelling that you've seen so far, when do you expect the restrictions to be able to be lifted?
So I think that if the modelling that the London School has done, I would expect that there's going to be needing some level of restrictions in place for the next 4 to 8 weeks. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm very grateful to both Dr. Hopkins and Professor Riley for their evidence today. We've run over time, but these are very important matters, and they will be debated in Parliament this afternoon. So you've done a service to this committee, but also to the House in appearing before us today. That concludes this meeting of the committee. Order, order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Committee Room 8